The canyon swallowed sound the way it swallowed hope. Marcus Stone learned this truth during his first month of exile when silence replaced the drum cadence that once ordered his days. 5 years passed since he turned his back on the cavalry, 5 years since he walked away from the massacre at Little Crow Creek and felt the weight of his sergeant's stripes cut from his shoulders like flesh from bone. The Army gave him a choice, then face court-martial for refusing a direct order or disappear into the territories with an unsigned warrant tucked into his conscience. He chose the canyon because men who wanted to forget learned quickly that forgetting required distance from anything that might remember them back. Blackthorn Canyon stretched across the southeastern corner of Arizona Territory like a scar that refused to heal properly. The locals claimed it was named for the thorny scrub that clawed up through cracks in the rust-colored stone, but Marcus knew better. The canyon earned its name from the way it drew blood from anyone foolish enough to seek shelter in its depths. The rock formations rose in jagged walls that caught the wind and turned it into voices, low moaning sounds that drove prospectors mad if they lingered through too many seasons. Summer heat reflected off the stone in visible waves that made distant objects shimmer and dance like spirits, while winter cold settled into the narrow passages and refused to leave even when the sun climbed high. Nothing about Blackthorn Canyon welcomed human habitation, which was precisely why Marcus built his cabin on its southern rim. The structure stood squat and functional, constructed from weathered pine, hauled up from the valley floor and stones pried loose from the canyon itself. Marcus built it with his own hands during that first brutal year, working through blistered palms and sunburned shoulders, because physical pain provided relief from the other kind. He designed the cabin with a single room and a porch that faced east, allowing him to watch the sunrise paint the canyon walls in shades of amber and gold. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney rising just high enough to clear the roofline without announcing his presence to anyone scanning the horizon. The furnishings consisted of necessities: a narrow cot with a straw mattress, a rough-hewn table with two chairs he built before remembering he would never need the second, and shelves that held his dwindling supplies of coffee, dried beans, and salt pork. Marcus woke before dawn out of habit, the same habit that made him inspect his Colt revolver each morning and check the Winchester rifle he kept mounted above the door. The Army trained such rituals into his bones, and exile failed to erase them. He stepped onto the porch as the first light crept over the canyon rim, his breath forming clouds in the October chill. The morning star still held its position above the western horizon, refusing to surrender to the coming day. He wore a wool shirt beneath a leather vest, both darkened by years of dust and weather, until they matched the canyon's palette of browns and grays. His hands bore calluses from work and old scars from war, while his face carried the deep lines of a man who spent more time squinting into the distance than meeting anyone's eyes up close. The scar on his left wrist caught the early light, a pale band of tissue that wrapped halfway around his forearm. It marked the place where iron shackles bit deep during 3 days of punishment after Little Crow Creek. The flesh healed poorly, leaving behind a ridge of tissue that sometimes ached when storms approached. Marcus made coffee over the fire, watching the ground swirl in the battered tin pot, and tried not to think about the nightmares that woke him twice during the night. The dreams always returned to the same scene of village burning, women screaming, children running through smoke, while cavalry troops fired methodically into lodges that collapsed in showers of sparks. He saw himself shouting at Captain Harrison, demanding the order to cease fire, and he felt again the rifle butt that crashed into his temple when he stepped between a trooper and a wounded woman trying to shield her daughter. The canyon brightened slowly, revealing its familiar contours. Marcus knew every formation and landmark within 5 miles: the split boulder, locals called Devil's Tooth, the narrow passage that twisted back on itself 3 times before opening onto the valley floor, the ancient cottonwood that somehow thrived where no water ran visible on the surface. He spent his days exploring these features, mapping them in his mind, the way other men mapped towns or territories. The canyon became his entire world by choice because the world beyond it held too many questions he could not answer and too many faces he could not forget. At mid-morning, he saddled his horse, a black gelding named Midnight, with a white star on his forehead, in the steady temperament of an animal that survived cavalry life. The horse came with him into exile, purchased from the Army's remuda, using the last of his mustering out pay. Marcus ran his hand along Midnight's neck, checking for swelling or heat, then tightened the cinch and swung into the saddle with practiced ease. His body remembered the motion even when his mind wandered elsewhere. They rode east along the canyon rim, following a trail only Marcus could distinguish from the surrounding rock. The October sun climbed higher, burning away the morning chill and replacing it with the dry heat that made everything smell of dust and stone. Marcus scanned the horizon automatically, watching for movement, for changes in the landscape, for any sign that his solitude might be interrupted. 5 years of isolation made him sensitive to disruption, capable of detecting shifts in the pattern of bird calls or the absence of wind where wind should blow. The canyon taught him to read its moods, to sense when something foreign entered its embrace. He found her tracks near Devil's Tooth boot prints, pressed into a patch of sandy soil between two stone outcroppings. The prints were small, likely from a woman, and they moved in an erratic pattern that suggested either injury or panic. Marcus dismounted and crouched beside the clearest print, studying its depth and angle. Fresh, less than an hour old, based on the way wind already began softening the edges. The stride was uneven, one foot dragging slightly as if the person favored one leg. He stood slowly, hand moving unconsciously to the colt on his hip, and followed the tracks deeper into the canyon. The trail led him to a section of blackthorn. He rarely visited a place where the walls narrowed into a slot barely wide enough for a horse. The stone rose 50 feet on either side, creating a corridor of perpetual shadow that stayed cool even in summer. Marcus walked carefully, leading Midnight behind him, eyes tracking the boot prints as they grew more erratic. The person stumbled here, caught themselves there, pressed a hand against the wall for balance. Blood appeared in small drops on the pale stone, dark rust brown in the dim light. Then he heard it, a sound so quiet he almost missed it, beneath the whisper of wind through the slot. Breathing shallow and rapid, the kind of breathing that came from pain or fear, or both. Marcus tied Midnight's reins to a scrub juniper and moved forward on foot, hand on his revolver, but not drawing it. The canyon opened slightly into a natural alcove where centuries of runoff carved a shallow depression in the rock. A massive boulder had fallen from above at some point, perhaps during the winter storms, that sometimes sent rock slides tumbling through the canyon. The boulder rested at an angle, propped against one wall, creating a gap beneath it like a cave mouth. She lay trapped beneath the boulder's edge, pinned from the waist down by stone that must have weighed several hundred pounds. Dust clung to her dark skin and darker hair, giving her the appearance of something formed from the canyon itself. Her dress was torn and stained with blood and dirt, the fabric once colorful, but now reduced to earth tones. She watched him approach with eyes that held no hope, only calculation, measuring him the way prey measured predators. Marcus froze when she spoke, her voice steady despite the obvious agony of her situation. "Make it quick, cowboy. I won't scream." The words landed between them like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through the charged air. Marcus understood immediately what she expected, what her experience taught her to expect from any white man who found her helpless. The knowledge hit him like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the reality of what men like him, men wearing cavalry blue, had done to make her speak those words without hesitation. He knelt slowly, keeping his hands visible, and met her eyes with an intensity that surprised them both. "I'm not here to hurt you." She studied his face, searching for the lie she expected to find there. Marcus held her gaze, letting her see whatever she needed to see, while his mind raced through calculations. The boulder was too heavy to lift alone, but perhaps he could lever it enough to pull her free. He examined the stone's position, the angle of pressure, the space available to work. His hands moved over the rock's surface, testing for purchase points, while she watched in silence. "What's your name?" The question came out rougher than he intended, his throat dry from the morning ride. She hesitated before answering, as if names were precious things not given freely to strangers. "Naira." The name carried weight, history, the cadence of a language Marcus recognized but did not speak. He nodded once, filing it away. "I'm Marcus. I'm going to get you out from under this rock, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that, trust?" Her response held an entire lifetime of betrayal compressed into a single bitter syllable. Marcus understood. He stood and returned to Midnight, retrieving a coil of rope and a length of pine he kept strapped to his saddle for making emergency repairs. When he returned to the alcove, Naira had closed her eyes, her breathing shallow but steady. She conserved her strength, a survivor's instinct. Marcus wedged the pine log under the boulder's edge, positioning it for maximum leverage. He tied one end of the rope around the log and the other around his waist, then braced his feet against the stone wall. The physics of the situation demanded careful timing. If he lifted the boulder even slightly, Naira would need to pull herself free in the handful of seconds before his strength failed. He explained this to her in short clipped sentences, watching her face for comprehension. When I lift you, crawl. Don't stop, don't think, just move. Understand? She nodded, gathering herself, hands positioned to push against the ground. Marcus could see the pain etched in the lines around her mouth, the way she bit down on her lower lip to keep from crying out. He counted down from 3, then threw his weight against the lever with everything he had. The boulder groaned, shifting fractionally upward. Marcus's muscles screamed as he maintained pressure veins standing out on his forearms and neck. Naira moved with desperate speed, dragging herself forward even as her legs twisted at unnatural angles. Her hands clawed at the dirt, propelling her body inch by agonizing inch, and Marcus held the boulder suspended through sheer force of will until she cleared the edge. He released the lever, and the boulder crashed back into place, sending up a cloud of dust and small stones. Marcus staggered, catching himself against the canyon wall, chest heaving. When he looked down, Naira lay motionless on the ground, eyes closed, face pale beneath the layer of dust. For a terrible moment, he thought she had died from the effort, but then he saw her chest rise and fall in shallow breaths. Marcus knelt beside her, hands hovering uncertainly. He had field medical training from his cavalry days enough to know she needed water and proper examination of her injuries, but touching her without permission felt like another kind of violation. He settled for speaking quietly, letting his voice anchor her to consciousness. You're safe now. I'm going to carry you to my cabin, where I can see to your injuries. I won't hurt you, Naira. You have my word. Her eyes opened slowly, focusing on his face with an expression Marcus could not quite read. Doubt warred with desperate hope. Exhaustion fought with the ingrained instinct to flee. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked, the words dying before they formed. Marcus retrieved his canteen and held it to her lips, letting her drink in small sips that would not cause cramping. The water revived her enough to whisper. Why? The question contained everything. Why help me? Why risk yourself? Why should I believe you? Marcus had no good answer, only the truth. Because leaving you here would make me the man I swore never to become. He lifted her as gently as possible, cradling her against his chest like something precious and breakable. She weighed almost nothing, her body slight and wasted by days of flight and hunger. Her head lolled against his shoulder, consciousness fading as shock and relief overwhelmed her system. Marcus carried her to midnight, then faced the problem of mounting while holding her. He solved it by draping her across the saddle first, then swinging up behind and gathering her against him. She moaned softly when the movement jostled her legs, but she did not fully wake. The ride back to the cabin took twice as long as usual, Marcus keeping midnight to a careful walk that would not jar his passenger unnecessarily. The sun climbed to its zenith and began its afternoon descent while they traveled, painting long shadows across the canyon floor. Marcus used the time to study Naira, noting details that would help him understand who she was and how she came to be trapped beneath a boulder in Blackthorn Canyon. Her dress was Apache in style, decorated with shell beads and dyed porcupine quills, arranged in geometric patterns that signaled clan affiliation to anyone who knew how to read such symbols. The fabric showed signs of hurried mending in several places, suggesting she had been on the run for some time before the boulder trapped her. Her hair hung in a single long braid down her back, coming loose in places where dirt and blood matted it together. She wore moccasins instead of boots, one of them torn nearly through at the sole. Most telling were her hands. The palms bore fresh blisters and cuts from scrambling over rough stone, while old scars on her knuckles spoke of harder times in the past. But the detail that caught Marcus's attention and held it were the bruises. Her arms bore fingerprint marks, dark purple-green impressions where someone gripped her hard enough to leave lasting damage. Similar marks circled her throat, faded but still visible. These injuries predated the boulder trap by several days at least, which meant someone pursued her before the rockfall. Someone who wanted her alive, at least initially, because dead women bore no bruises from restraint. Marcus's jaw tightened as anger built in his chest. He recognized the signs of a woman being hunted, and the knowledge brought memories flooding back unbidden. He saw again the village at Little Crow Creek, remembered women dragged from burning lodges, while their men lay dead in the dirt. He heard Captain Harrison's voice ordering the troops to secure any survivors for transport to the reservation, the word secure carrying implications that made Marcus's stomach turn even years later. He felt again the weight of his rifle in his hands and the terrible decision point where duty and conscience diverged into irreconcilable paths. The cabin appeared ahead, its rough outline emerging from the heat shimmer like something conjured. Marcus had never felt more grateful to see his exile's refuge. He dismounted carefully, then lifted Naira down and carried her inside. The interior was dim after the brightness outside, cool and smelling of wood smoke and coffee grounds. He laid her on his cot, the only proper bed in the single room, and stood back to assess the situation. She needed cleaning first to see the extent of her injuries beneath the dirt and blood. Marcus heated water over the fire, then searched his meager supplies for anything resembling medical materials. He found clean rags, a bottle of whiskey he kept for emergencies, needle and thread, and some dried herbs. A prospector traded him years ago for fixing his broken wagon wheel. The herbs were supposed to prevent infection, though Marcus possessed only the vaguest understanding of how to use them. While the water heated, he examined Naira more carefully. Her right leg showed the worst damage, swollen and discolored from hip to ankle, where the boulder pinned her. Marcus tested the bones, gently relieved when he found no obvious fractures despite the severity of the bruising. Her left leg seemed mostly uninjured aside from cuts and scrapes. The bruises on her arms and throat worried him, more evidence of violence that spoke to darker pursuits than simple accident. Marcus cleaned her wounds with warm water and cloth, working as gently as his calloused hands allowed. He removed her torn moccasins and washed her feet, noting the condition of someone who had been running hard for days. The soles were cut and blistered, several toenails blackened from impact trauma. He cleaned these injuries too, applying the whiskey despite knowing it would burn terribly when she woke. Better pain now than infection later. Her dress was beyond saving torn and filthy, but removing it without permission felt wrong. Marcus compromised by cutting away the worst damaged sections to access her injuries, leaving enough fabric to preserve her modesty. He worked quickly and professionally, drawing on cavalry experience, treating wounded soldiers in the field. His hands stayed steady even when he found more bruises beneath her clothing, evidence of systematic violence that made his blood run cold. When he finished cleaning and bandaging her injuries, Marcus covered her with his spare blanket and built up the fire. The temperature would drop quickly after sunset, and she needed warmth to fight off shock. He brewed strong coffee and ate a cold meal of jerky and hardtack, watching her sleep and wondering what would happen when she woke. Would she trust him? Would she bolt at the first opportunity? Would she explain how she came to be trapped beneath a boulder with signs of pursuit marking her body? The sun descended toward the western horizon, painting the cabin walls in shades of orange and gold. Shadows lengthened across the floor, pooling in corners and gathering around the unconscious woman on his cot. Marcus sat in the chair by the table coat within easy reach and watched both Naira and the door. He had no reason to expect trouble, but 5 years of isolation taught him that trouble arrived precisely when you stopped expecting it. Night fell completely, bringing the profound darkness that existed only in places far from civilization. The fire provided the only light, painting everything in flickering amber. Outside, coyotes began their evening chorus, voices rising and falling in eerie harmonies that echoed through the canyon. Marcus listened to them absently, his attention divided between the woman on his cot and his own memories of other women and other times who needed help that came too late. Naira woke near midnight, consciousness returning in a rush that brought her upright before her injuries reminded her why that was a terrible idea. She gasped, falling back against the thin mattress, eyes wide and frightened as they swept the unfamiliar cabin interior. Marcus remained motionless in his chair, hands visible on the table, letting her orient herself without feeling threatened. Her gaze found him and locked on, assessing him the way she did beneath the boulder. He watched her mind work through the situation. Strange cabin, strange man, her own body cleaned and bandaged while she slept. Terror and calculation warred in her expression, each fighting for dominance. Marcus spoke quietly, keeping his voice level and unthreatening. "You're safe. I brought you here from the canyon after getting you free of the boulder. I cleaned your wounds and gave you water. You've been sleeping about 6 hours," she said, nothing, still evaluating whether his words matched reality or concealed darker intent. Her eyes tracked to the door, measuring the distance, gauging whether her injured leg would support an escape attempt. Marcus read her thoughts easily, having seen the same calculation in trapped animals. "You can leave if you want, I won't stop you. But it's full dark outside and your leg won't carry you far. Stay the night, at least recover your strength. I'll sleep on the floor." Naira's hand moved to her throat, fingers touching the bruises there with unconscious memory of how they formed. She looked at Marcus again, this time seeing something that made her shoulders relax fractionally. When she spoke, her voice came rough from disuse and dehydration. Water. Marcus rose slowly and filled a tin cup from his barrel, then brought it to her. She took it with both hands, drinking in careful sips that suggested someone taught her properly. He returned to his chair and waited while she emptied the cup, then refilled it when she held it out. Thank you. The words cost her something, Marcus realized. Pride, perhaps, or the acknowledgement that she needed help from anyone, and especially a white man who found her helpless. He nodded acceptance, saying nothing, giving her space to process her situation. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the snap and pop of burning wood in the fireplace. Naira studied him openly, now taking in details she missed during their first encounter. She saw the scar on his wrist, the way he held his body with military precision, even sitting relaxed, the lines on his face that came from squinting into desert sun, and something harder than weather. She saw the weapons he kept within reach, but also the careful way he moved to avoid startling her. The professional competence of her bandages, the fact that he left her clothes intact despite having every opportunity to do otherwise. Who are you, Marcus considered how to answer. The truth was complicated, layered with decisions and consequences that took years to unpack. He settled for the simplest version. Marcus Stone. I live alone in this canyon. I'm not looking for trouble, and I'm not in the habit of hurting people who don't hurt me first. Naira absorbed this, filing it away for future reference. She shifted on the cot, testing her leg's condition, wincing when pain shot through the damaged tissue. Marcus saw her expression and spoke before she could ask. No broken bones that I could find, but severe bruising from the boulder. You'll need to stay off it for at least a week before you can walk properly. Longer before you can run. The word run hung in the air between them, acknowledging without stating directly that he knew she had been fleeing something or someone. Naira's eyes narrowed, measuring whether he was friend or another kind of threat. Marcus met her gaze steadily, letting her see whatever she needed to see. Are you going to ask me why I was in your canyon? Her question carried challenge, daring him to push into her secrets before she was ready to share them. Marcus shook his head. When you're ready to tell me, I'll listen. Until then, it's your business. The answer surprised her. He could see it in the way her expression shifted. She had expected interrogation demands for information, the kind of transactional relationship where help came with prices attached. Instead, Marcus offered something closer to respect, the acknowledgement that she had a right to her own story and the choice of when to share it. They fell into silence again, this one less tense than before. Naira's eyelids grew heavy as exhaustion reclaimed her. The adrenaline that kept her alert during their initial exchange fading now that immediate danger seemed absent. She fought against sleep, unwilling to surrender consciousness in a stranger's presence. But her body had other ideas. Her eyes closed despite her best efforts, her breathing slowing into the deep rhythm of someone whose reserves were completely spent. Marcus watched her fall asleep, noting the way even unconscious she maintained tension in her shoulders, ready to wake and flee at the first sign of danger. He stood quietly and retrieved a bedroll from his storage chest, spreading it on the floor near the fire. The night ahead would be uncomfortable, the hard-packed dirt offering little cushion, but he had slept in worse conditions during his cavalry years. Discomfort was a small price for doing the right thing, for choosing the path he should have chosen 5 years ago at Little Crow Creek. He lay awake long after banking, the fire staring at the ceiling, while his mind circled through possibilities and problems. Naira was Apache, that much was clear from her dress and features. She bore signs of violence and pursuit, suggesting someone wanted her badly enough to follow her into Blackthorn Canyon's harsh environment. The bruises on her throat and arms spoke of capture and escape, a cycle that might repeat itself if her pursuer still tracked her. Marcus understood he had inserted himself into someone else's conflict by helping her, and that involvement would bring consequences he could not yet predict. But he also understood with the kind of bone-deep certainty that only came from hard-won experience that he had no choice. He could not leave her trapped beneath that boulder any more than he could travel back in time and change what happened at Little Crow Creek. Some decisions once made defined you forever, for good or ill. Marcus chose to be defined by the boulder he lifted rather than the massacre he failed to prevent. Sleep came eventually, bringing dreams that mixed past and present into uncomfortable collages. He saw Little Crow Creek burning while Naira's voice called out from inside a collapsing lodge. He felt again the rifle butt crashing into his skull while simultaneously he lifted the boulder. his strength failing the stone, crushing down on someone he needed to save. The dreams tangled together until he could not separate memory from imagination, until he woke gasping in the pre-dawn darkness, with sweat cooling on his face. Naira was awake too, watching him from the cot with eyes that held understanding. She had nightmares as well, he realized. She recognized the signs in his sudden waking, the way he oriented himself to confirm reality matched the cabin, instead of whatever horror his sleeping mind conjured. Neither spoke, acknowledging each other's pain through silence that felt more intimate than words. Marcus rose and stirred the coals into life, adding wood to chase away the pre-dawn chill. He put coffee on to boil and opened his small store of cornmeal, deciding breakfast would be simple mush with dried berries mixed in for flavor. The day's first light crept through the cabin's single window, painting the room in gradual stages. Marcus moved through his morning routine with practiced efficiency, aware of Naira tracking his every movement. She was memorizing the space, he realized, cataloging exits and weapons, building a mental map of her environment, the way any hunted creature learned its surroundings. He approved of her caution, the practical awareness that kept people alive when danger lurked beyond every horizon. When breakfast was ready, Marcus brought her a bowl and watched while she ate with careful deliberation. She was hungry, that was obvious, but she maintained control over her need, taking small bites and chewing thoroughly. Someone taught her proper survival habits, how to make scarce food last, how to avoid eating so fast that it made her sick. These were lessons learned hard and remembered harder. Afterward, Marcus helped her stand for the first time since the boulder. She leaned heavily on him, testing her damaged leg with grimaces that turned into determination. She managed 3 halting steps before pain forced her to stop breathing hard from the effort. Marcus guided her back to the cot, noting her frustration with the limitation. She wanted to be strong enough to flee if necessary, and her body refused to cooperate with that desire. You'll heal faster if you rest. Pushing too hard now will set you back days or weeks. His words held the weight of experience, lessons learned, watching soldiers try to return to duty before their injuries mended properly. Naira heard the truth in them, but clearly disliked accepting it. She lay back on the cot, defeat showing in the set of her shoulders. Marcus understood her frustration, the terrible vulnerability of being trapped somewhere with no control over her own mobility. He resolved to make her recovery as quick as possible, both for her sake and his own peace of mind. The day passed slowly, marked by small interactions and longer silences. Marcus tended to his normal chores, checking midnight, repairing tack, splitting wood for the coming winter, while Naira rested and watched. She seemed fascinated by his competent efficiency, the way he accomplished tasks without wasted motion or excessive effort. Perhaps she had expected something different, some manifestation of the slovenly or violent nature she associated with white men. Instead, she found someone who moved through his isolated life with quiet capability, asking nothing from her except permission to help. By afternoon, the tension between them eased enough for basic conversation. Naira asked about the canyon, its history and geography, and Marcus answered with the accumulated knowledge of 5 years' residence. He described the seasonal patterns where water could be found during dry spells, which passages flooded during storms. He spoke about the wildlife, the golden eagles that nested in the high cliffs, the rattlesnakes that basked on sun-warmed rocks, the occasional mountain lion that passed through following deer migrations. He told her about the old prospectors who still worked, played out claims too stubborn or too broken to admit defeat and move on. Naira listened carefully, filing away information that might prove useful. She asked intelligent questions that revealed her own understanding of living off the land, of reading natural signs and predicting weather patterns. They found common ground and practical knowledge, a language both spoke fluently despite coming from vastly different worlds. The conversation remained surface level, neither pushing into personal territory, but it established a foundation of basic trust that had not existed the night before. As evening approached, Marcus prepared a more substantial meal: beans, cooked with salt pork and dried onions, bannock bread fried in bacon fat, coffee strong enough to strip paint. Naira ate with better appetite this time, her body beginning to recover from its ordeal now that she had food, water, and relative safety. Color returned to her face, replacing the deathly pallor of the previous night. She moved with less caution, testing her injuries and finding them painful but manageable. After dinner, they sat in comfortable silence while the fire burned low. Marcus cleaned his weapons with methodical care, checking and oiling each piece while Naira watched. She seemed to approve of his maintenance routine, nodding slightly when he performed certain actions. Perhaps her people had similar customs around weapons, care understanding that tools kept you alive only if you treated them with respect. The second night passed more peacefully than the first. Naira slept deeply, her exhaustion finally overcoming her wariness while Marcus dozed lightly in his bedroll on the floor. He woke several times to check on her, reassuring himself she still breathed easily, that her injuries had not worsened during the night. Each time he found her resting quietly, and each time he felt a knot of tension in his chest ease slightly. Morning brought warm sunshine and clear skies, the kind of October day that made the desert seem almost friendly. Marcus opened the door and windows to air out the cabin, letting fresh breeze flow through while he made breakfast. Naira woke slowly, blinking in the increased light, and Marcus saw something different in her expression. A tentative relaxation, the first stages of accepting her situation, rather than fighting against it every moment. He helped her outside to the porch, supporting her weight while she hobbled on her good leg. She sat in the chair he brought out for her, tilting her face toward the sun with an expression of pure relief. She had been trapped underground beneath the boulder, Marcus realized, buried in darkness, for who knew how long before he found her. The sunlight must feel like resurrection, warmth and light returning after hours or days of cold stone pressing down. They sat together on the porch, sharing the morning in silence that felt less like absence of conversation and more like communication beyond words. Marcus watched the canyon wake up around them, birds calling from hidden perches, a hawk circling lazy patterns overhead, the play of sunlight across the striated rock walls. Beside him, Naira watched the same things, but he suspected she saw them differently, through eyes trained by different culture and experience, to read meanings he could not access. "Can I ask you something?" Her question broke the silence gently, not shattering the peace, but expanding it to include voiced thoughts. Marcus nodded, bracing himself for whatever might come. "The scar on your wrist, how did you get it?" Marcus's hand moved automatically to cover the mark, old shame and older anger rising together. He had not spoken about Little Crow Creek to anyone since walking away from the army, had spent 5 years avoiding even thinking about it directly. But Naira asked with the directness of someone who survived her own traumas, who understood that some stories needed telling even when they hurt. He took a breath and let his hand fall away from the scar, exposing it to her view and to his own acknowledgement. Cavalry patrol. 5 years ago, down in New Mexico territory, we received orders to secure an Apache village suspected of raiding supply wagons. The orders were clear: neutralize any resistance, take survivors for transport to reservation land. Marcus paused, old pain evident in the tightness of his jaw. Naira said nothing, giving him space to continue. We reached the village at dawn. The men were already gone out hunting or raiding, the captain didn't care which. Only women, children, and a few elders remained. The captain gave the order to fire on the lodges, to burn them out. I saw what was happening, and I couldn't follow that order. Shouted at the captain to cease fire, physically tried to stop one of my troopers from shooting into a lodge where I could hear children crying. The words came faster now, 5 years of suppressed memory flowing out. The captain had me restrained. Court-martial for refusing orders, he said. They shackled me to a post overnight while the village burned. These marks, Marcus held up his wrist, these came from the irons. 3 days they kept me chained while they debated whether to hang me or just dishonorably discharge me. In the end, they gave me a choice: face trial or disappear. I chose disappearing. Naira's expression remained neutral throughout his confession, but Marcus saw understanding in her eyes. She knew villages that burned, knew women and children who died while men were absent. She probably knew soldiers who followed orders without question, and others who followed them with enthusiasm. Marcus wondered if she knew the specific village he spoke of, if her people heard about Little Crow Creek and carried that story forward as warning or wound. That village had a name: Little Crow Creek. 23 lodges, maybe 60 people total. 14 confirmed dead after the fire, the rest driven onto the reservation where they starved that winter because the government supplies never arrived on time. He met her eyes directly, unflinching. I did not stop it. I tried, but I failed. I tell you this so you understand who I am and what I'm capable of, or incapable of, depending on how you measure such things. The silence that followed felt heavy, weighted with history and unspoken questions. Naira looked away toward the canyon, her profile stark against the morning light. When she spoke, her voice carried a quality Marcus could not quite identify. Not forgiveness exactly, but something close to recognition. My village was called Split Rock. Apache bands from three valleys gathered there each summer for trading and ceremony. 3 years ago, cavalry troops surrounded us during the night. They waited until dawn, then attacked while people were preparing the morning meal. They killed anyone who resisted and burned the lodges with some people still inside. Her hands gripped the chair, arms knuckles white with pressure. I survived because my brother pushed me into a root cellar and covered the entrance with a grinding stone before they found him. I stayed hidden for 2 days, listening to the soldiers search through the ruins. When I finally came out, everyone was dead or gone. 67 people, my entire family. Marcus felt his chest constrict with the weight of her story. He wanted to apologize, to offer some word that might ease her pain, but he understood words would mean nothing. Instead, he simply nodded, acknowledging what she shared and the trust required to share it. Was that Little Crow Creek? Marcus searched his memory of the reports he read during those terrible days before his discharge. Little Crow Creek was New Mexico territory. Split Rock should be Arizona, he thought, maybe 60 miles south of here. Different patrol, different captain, but the same orders flowing from the same policy, the same willingness to categorize an entire people as enemies requiring elimination or control. Different attack, same war. Naira's laugh held no humor, only bitter recognition of the pattern. She turned back to face him, and Marcus saw questions forming behind her eyes. She wanted to ask more, but held back, perhaps uncertain whether she wanted the answers. The rest of the morning passed in easier silence than before, the kind that came after difficult truths were spoken and survived. Marcus worked through his chores while Naira watched her presence on the porch, feeling less like intrusion and more like belonging. He found himself explaining what he did, and why not because she asked, but because the isolation had made him unused to having another person around, and words filled the strangeness of sharing space. By afternoon, he decided to teach her something useful. He helped her into the cabin and retrieved a basket of dried plants he had collected throughout the summer: yarrow for wounds, willow bark for pain, sage for infection prevention. He had learned these remedies through trial and error trading with passing prospectors and a few Apache traders who still moved through the territory despite increasing danger. His knowledge was fragmentary at best, cobbled together from multiple sources and probably missing crucial preparation steps, but it was better than nothing. Naira's eyes lit up when she saw the plants. She reached for the sage first, crushing a few leaves between her fingers and inhaling deeply. Her expression shifted into something closer to joy, or perhaps relief at finding something familiar in this strange situation. "You know these plants?" Marcus's question was unnecessary. Her reaction made the answer obvious. She nodded, sorting through the basket with practiced familiarity, identifying each plant and explaining its uses in a mix of English and Apache words. Her English was good, better than Marcus expected, suggesting she had contact with white settlements at some point. But she lapsed into her native language when discussing the plant's spiritual or ceremonial properties, as if those concepts resisted translation. She showed him proper preparation methods, which parts of the yarrow to use, how much willow bark to steep for pain relief, the way sage should be bundled and dried before burning for purification. Marcus watched carefully, filing away information that might prove useful. He had survived 5 years through practical knowledge and luck in roughly equal measure. Additional healing skills would only improve those odds. While they worked with the plants, Naira's hands moving with confidence, despite her injuries, Marcus found himself relaxing in ways he had not relaxed since leaving the army. The work gave them common purpose, something to focus on besides the uncomfortable realities of their respective traumas. The cabin filled with the scent of crushed herbs and Naira's quiet explanations, creating an atmosphere of domestic peace that felt foreign and familiar simultaneously. By evening, Marcus noticed Naira's leg looked better. The swelling had decreased noticeably and she moved with less obvious pain. She caught him observing and smiled slightly, the first smile he had seen from her. "The plants work better when prepared correctly. Also, you had more willow bark than you realize. The pain relief helps my body focus energy on healing instead of hurting." Marcus accepted this wisdom, recognizing truth in how she approached healing as holistic rather than purely mechanical. His cavalry medical training focused on stopping bleeding and preventing infection. Naira understood medicine as involving the whole person, including their mental state and spiritual well-being. Both approaches had value, he thought, and combining them probably produced better results than either alone. That night, they ate together at the table, instead of Marcus bringing food to her at the cot. Her legs still could not support her weight fully, but she could hobble short distances with Marcus's arm for support. Sitting across from each other felt significant, somehow, an acknowledgement that she was recovering and that their roles were shifting from rescuer-victim towards something closer to equal sharing space. The conversation drifted towards safer topics, weather patterns the coming winter, whether Marcus's supplies would last until spring. Naira asked questions about his life in the canyon, and Marcus found himself answering more freely than before. He described the loneliness, the way silence became so profound it developed texture and weight. He talked about what he missed from his army life, the camaraderie, the sense of purpose, the structured days, and what he did not miss at all. Naira shared carefully selected pieces of her own story. She spoke of growing up in the Apache bands that still moved freely through Arizona and New Mexico territories before the wars intensified. She described the traditional ways her mother taught her identifying plants, reading animal tracks, preparing food, creating the intricate beadwork that decorated ceremonial clothing. She mentioned her brother only briefly, pain flickering across her face, and Marcus did not push for details. As night deepened and the fire burned low, they fell into comfortable quiet. Marcus noticed Naira's eyes growing heavy exhaustion, claiming her, despite her best efforts to stay alert. He stood and helped her to the cot, supporting her weight while she hobbled across the room. She lay down with visible relief, her body sinking into the thin mattress. "Thank you." The words came softly, almost too quiet to hear. Marcus nodded acknowledgement, then retreated to his bedroll by the fire. He lay awake, listening to her breathing, settle into sleep's rhythm, thinking about the strange twist of fate that brought her into his isolated existence. 5 years he spent alone, deliberately avoiding human contact, building walls of silence and distance between himself and the world's complexity. Now those walls felt less solid, cracked by the simple act of lifting a boulder off a woman he had no reason to help beyond basic human decency. The third day brought rain, unusual for October, but not unheard of in canyon country. The clouds rolled in during the night and dawn arrived gray and dripping. Water sheeted off the cabin's roof in irregular streams, drumming against the ground with irregular rhythm. Marcus woke to the sound and immediately checked his roof for leaks, finding two small drips that required pots positioned beneath to catch the water. Naira woke soon after the change in weather, disturbing her rest. They spent the rainy day indoors, the cabin feeling smaller, with both of them confined to its single room. Marcus worked on repairing tack, while Naira continued sorting through his plant collection, preparing medicines, and showing him proper storage methods. They spoke little, but the silence felt companionable rather than awkward, two people comfortable enough to share space without constant interaction. The rain ended by evening, leaving the canyon transformed. The usually dry stone glistened with moisture, and the air smelled of wet earth and sage. Small streams appeared in normally dry washes, flowing briefly before soaking into the thirsty ground. Marcus stood on the porch, watching water drip from the eaves while Naira sat in the chair beside him, both of them savoring the cooler, cleaner air. "Tomorrow I want to try walking further." Naira's statement carried determination Marcus recognized from his cavalry days. Soldiers recovering from wounds always pushed too hard too fast, eager to prove they were whole again. He understood the impulse, but also its dangers. Start slow, short distances with rest between. Your leg will tell you when you've done too much, usually right before it collapses under you. She glanced at him, reading the experience behind his words. "You've recovered from injuries." Marcus nodded. 3 gunshot wounds, 1 broken arm, countless scrapes and sprains. The body heals itself if you give it time and don't force things. Impatience causes permanent damage. Naira absorbed this wisdom, clearly weighing her desire to recover quickly against the practical advice he offered. She said nothing more, but Marcus suspected she would follow his guidance. She struck him as someone who learned from experience and adapted accordingly, not stubborn in ways that caused unnecessary suffering. The fourth day dawned clear and cool, the rain having scrubbed away the desert's usual haze. Visibility stretched for miles, revealing details normally obscured by heat, shimmer, and dust. Marcus helped Naira through a series of short walks from the cabin to the corral, from the porch to the woodpile, each trip followed by rest and assessment. Her leg held up better than he expected, the swelling almost completely gone now, though the deep bruising would take weeks to fully heal. By afternoon, she felt confident enough to venture further. Marcus saddled Midnight and led him to the porch, then helped Naira mount. She winced when her injured legs swung over the horse's back, but she settled into the saddle with obvious relief at being mobile again. Marcus took Midnight's reins and walked slowly, letting the horse's gentle gait carry Naira without jarring her injuries. They traveled along the canyon rim, Marcus pointing out landmarks and explaining the terrain. Naira listened intently, her eyes tracking everything he showed her, memorizing routes and locations, with the focus of someone planning for an uncertain future. Marcus understood she was building mental maps for potential escape routes, and he felt no offense at her pragmatism. Trust came slowly when survival was never guaranteed. The ride took them past Devil's Tooth, the split boulder that marked the trail leading down to where Marcus found her. Naira stared at the formation, her expression unreadable, perhaps remembering the boulder that trapped her, or perhaps thinking of events preceding that trap. Marcus gave her space for private reflection, saying nothing until they moved beyond sight of the landmark. When they returned to the cabin, Naira was visibly tired but smiling. The time outside and the movement clearly lifted her spirits despite physical exhaustion. Marcus helped her dismount and supported her walk back to the cabin, noting she put slightly more weight on her injured leg than before. Progress measurable and real. That evening, as they shared another simple meal, Naira asked the question Marcus had been expecting since the first night. How long will you let me stay? The question carried layers, practical concern about overstaying, welcome deeper worry about when trust might evaporate, perhaps even testing whether his kindness had limits attached. Marcus set down his coffee cup and met her eyes directly. As long as you need, I'm not in the habit of turning people out before they're ready to survive on their own. But she heard the unspoken caveat, the reality that kindness could not protect them forever from outside forces. But whoever was chasing you will eventually track you here if they haven't already. When that happens, things will get complicated. Naira nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth she already knew. She looked down at her hands, fingers tracing patterns on the rough wooden table. His name is Silas Cade. He's a tracker and bounty hunter. The army hired him to find survivors from Split Rock and bring them to the reservation. I escaped transport 3 months ago, and he's been following me since. Marcus absorbed this information, his mind already working through implications. A professional tracker meant someone skilled at reading signs, persistent and motivated by payment rather than ideology. Such men could be reasoned with through superior payment, but they could also be dangerous if they felt their reputation was at stake. 3 months is a long chase. He must want you badly. Not just me. Naira's voice dropped lower, forcing Marcus to lean forward to hear clearly. I carry something he needs to get back. Evidence of what really happened at Split Rock and other villages. Documents I took from the transport wagon when I escaped. Marcus felt his pulse quicken, but he kept his voice steady, giving her space to share at her own pace. Documents meant official records, possibly proof of the kind of orders that led to Little Crow Creek and Split Rock. But soldiers carried documents for transport all the time. Supply requisitions, patrol orders, routine correspondence. What made these worth dying for Naira's hands shook slightly as she withdrew the first paper from the pouch. When she unfolded it, Marcus understood immediately why Cade had chased her across 3 territories for 3 months. It was a military order, but not the kind that passed through normal channels. The header read, Confidential Territorial Mining Commission, rather than War Department. The order authorized cavalry troops to secure by any means necessary Apache lands in designated quadrants, each quadrant labeled with surveyor's notes about mineral deposits. Gold, silver, copper, not enemy combatants, not hostile raiders, mineral deposits. The signature at the bottom belonged to Colonel Vernon Ashford, but it was the date that made Marcus's breath catch 3 weeks before Little Crow Creek. The order he had refused, the massacre he failed to prevent, had not been about security or defense. It had been about gold, discovered in the ground beneath an Apache village. His hands tightened on the paper, creasing its edges. 5 years he carried guilt for failing to save that village, believing he had been too slow or too weak to stop military necessity. Now he understood there was no necessity, only greed. Men, women, and children burned alive because someone found shiny rocks in a stream bed. There's more. Naira's voice pulled him back. She showed him the second document, a letter from Ashford to mining executives discussing cleared territories and purchase prices. The tone was businesslike, discussing human lives with the same casual efficiency as livestock transactions. The Split Rock incident has concluded successfully, opening approximately 4,000 acres for immediate exploitation. The third document was a financial ledger showing payments from mining companies to various territorial officials, including judges and the governor. The amounts were staggering, tens of thousands of dollars in changing hands to facilitate what the ledger euphemistically called land acquisition projects. Marcus looked up at Naira, seeing in her face the same cold rage that burned in his chest. This is systematic genocide for profit. Ashford orchestrated massacres across multiple territories, sold the confiscated land to mining companies, and used the proceeds to buy off anyone who might investigate. And the army provided the muscle. Her statement was not quite accusation, but it carried weight nonetheless. Marcus nodded slowly, accepting the truth of it. The institution he served, the uniform he wore with pride, had been weaponized by corruption into something monstrous. I knew the orders were wrong. I knew villages were being targeted without provocation. But I thought it was policy. Misguided, brutal, but policy. I never imagined it was just murder for money dressed in official uniforms. Naira placed her hand on his scarred wrist, the touch gentle, despite her own pain. Most soldiers didn't know either. They followed orders they were told came from Washington, from generals, from leaders they were trained to obey. You're the exception, Marcus. You're the one who questioned. The absolution in her words felt unearned, but Marcus let himself accept it. They could not change the past. They could only try to prevent the future from repeating the same atrocities. If we can get these documents to federal authorities outside Ashford's influence, real federal authorities, not territorial puppets, we can expose the entire conspiracy. He'll hang. They'll all hang, if we survive long enough to reach those authorities. Naira's pragmatism was warranted. Ashford had resources, connections, hired guns. Two people carrying evidence of his crimes would not survive long once he learned they possessed these documents, which meant Cade's pursuit was not just about retrieving escaped property, it was about eliminating witnesses to mass murder. We need allies, people with authority who aren't bought off. Marcus thought of Sheriff Garrett, who had walked away from bad orders years ago at Fort Davis. If anyone in this territory might help them, it was Davis. But reaching Ironwood Bluff meant traveling through open country where Cade could intercept them. The choice came down to simple mathematics. Stay hidden in the canyon and eventually be found or run toward help and risk being caught in between. Neither option offered safety, only different flavors of danger. But Marcus had spent 5 years hiding, and hiding had saved no one. It was time to run towards something instead of away from everything. Marcus stood and paced the small cabin, thinking through strategies and risks. If Cade was tracking Naira, he would eventually reach Blackthorn Canyon if he had not already. A professional tracker would not give up easily, especially if his employers desperately wanted those documents destroyed. The canyon's isolation offered some protection, but not enough if Cade came with armed support. We need to make a plan for when he arrives. This cabin is defensible, but not impregnable. We'd be better off having options beyond fighting from a fixed position. Naira watched him pace, seeing the soldier re-emerge beneath the Excel's exterior. Marcus's mind shifted into tactical mode, automatically assessing approaches, fields of fire escape routes. 5 years away from the army had not erased his training, merely buried it beneath layers of deliberate disuse. You would fight for me. Her question held genuine surprise, tinged with something else Marcus could not quite identify. He stopped pacing and faced her directly. I told you before leaving, you to suffer would make me the man I swore never to become. That applies to letting someone drag you away against your will as much as it applies to leaving you under a boulder. But he will come with others. You could die. Marcus shrugged, the gesture encompassing years of accepting that possibility. We all die eventually. Might as well choose how it happens. The statement hung between them, baldly honest in its fatalism. Naira studied his face, searching for bravado or false heroism, finding only calm acceptance of potential consequences. Something in her expression shifted, hardened with resolve. Then we prepare together. I won't hide behind you when he comes. This is my fight as much as yours now. Marcus recognized the tone, the same one he heard from soldiers before battles when camaraderie transcended self-interest. He nodded once, acknowledging her commitment and accepting it without argument. They were in this together now, whatever this became. The next morning, Marcus began preparing the cabin for potential siege. He reinforced the door with additional lumber, ensuring it could withstand battering. He checked his ammunition supply, 60 rounds for the Winchester 40 for the Colt, and cleaned both weapons thoroughly. He identified firing positions that offered cover while maintaining lines of sight to likely approach routes. He filled extra water barrels and moved his food stores inside, preparing for the possibility of being trapped indoors for extended periods. Naira contributed what she could despite her limited mobility. She prepared medical supplies, anticipating injuries and organizing treatments for various scenarios. She showed Marcus how to make poultices that would draw out infection and prepare teas that reduce fever. She explained Apache fighting tactics, how her people used terrain and misdirection to overcome numerical disadvantages. Marcus listened carefully, recognizing valuable information when he heard it. By the fifth day, Naira could walk short distances without support. The improvement was remarkable testament to both her Apache medicine knowledge and her body's inherent resilience. She insisted on walking to the place where she buried the documents, needing to confirm they remained hidden and undiscovered. Marcus accompanied her, carrying his Winchester and maintaining alert watch for any signs of pursuit. The cache site was a quarter-mile from the cabin, tucked beneath an overhang that protected it from rain and casual observation. Naira removed stones, carefully revealing a leather pouch wrapped in oiled cloth. She opened the pouch and withdrew several folded papers, handling them with reverence that suggested their importance transcended mere evidence. Marcus waited while she verified the documents' condition, not pushing to see them himself. They were her property, her leverage, her choice whether to share. Eventually, she refolded the papers and looked up at him. "Do you want to see what I nearly died protecting?" Marcus nodded slowly. Naira handed him the first document, a military requisition form dated 3 years prior. Marcus scanned the contents, his stomach tightening as he read. The form authorized cavalry troops to secure Apache lands, suspected of harboring gold deposits, using any means necessary to remove current inhabitants. The signature at the bottom belonged to a colonel Marcus recognized, though the name made his chest constrict. Colonel Vernon Ashford, currently serving as head of the Territorial Mining Commission in Phoenix. The second document was worse. It outlined a systematic campaign across New Mexico and Arizona territories, targeting specific Apache villages near potential mineral sites. Split Rock was listed along with the Little Crow Creek and a dozen other locations Marcus recognized from newspaper reports of skirmishes and hostile encounters. The pattern was unmistakable whenever surveyors identified valuable deposits on Apache land. Cavalry troops arrived soon after to eliminate the competition. The final document was a personal letter from Ashford to his second-in-command discussing the financial arrangements for selling confiscated land to mining companies. The tone was casual, discussing the deaths of children and elders with the same administrative detachment as inventory accounting. Marcus felt rage building in his chest as he read the same rage that made him refuse orders at Little Crow Creek 5 years ago. This is why Cade hunts you so desperately. If these documents reach the right people, Ashford and everyone involved will hang. Naira took the papers back and rewrapped them carefully. They killed my family for gold. They killed dozens of families. And nobody cared because we were just Apache, just obstacles to profit. Her voice remained steady, but Marcus heard the ocean of grief beneath the surface. He understood why she carried these documents for 3 months, why she risked everything to keep them safe. They were not just evidence. They were testimony, proof that her people's deaths meant something beyond random violence. We'll get them to someone who can act on them. I swear it. Marcus made the promise, knowing its weight, knowing it would likely cost him the precarious peace he built during 5 years of exile. But some promises needed making, regardless of consequences. Some stands needed taking, even when outcomes were uncertain. They returned to the cabin in silence, both processing what the documents meant and what keeping them safe would require. Marcus spent the afternoon expanding their defensive preparations while Naira worked on strengthening her leg through careful exercise. Neither spoke about the documents again, but their presence affected everything, adding urgency to preparations that might have otherwise felt abstract. The 6th day brought the first concrete sign of pursuit. Marcus was checking the canyon's eastern approaches when he spotted boot prints in soft sand near a seasonal water source. The prints were fresh, less than a day old, and they told a clear story, a single rider moving carefully, scouting the terrain rather than advancing directly. Professional tracking behavior, the kind that preceded ambush or assault by several days. Marcus returned to the cabin and informed Naira of his discovery. Her face paled slightly, but she nodded with grim acceptance. Cade. He always scouts thoroughly before moving in. It gives him time to identify escape routes and plan counters to any defensive strategy. How long do we have? Naira considered, drawing on her experience being hunted. 2 days, maybe 3. He'll watch from a distance, first learning our patterns and identifying vulnerabilities. Then he'll either approach alone to negotiate or bring others for an assault. Marcus accepted her assessment, trusting her knowledge of Cade's methods. 2 or 3 days meant they needed to accelerate preparations and finalize their strategy. He spent the rest of the day improving sightlines around the cabin, clearing brush that might provide cover for attackers. He positioned supplies at strategic locations, ensuring quick access to water, ammunition, and medical materials, regardless of where fighting occurred. That night, Marcus and Naira sat by the fire discussing their options. They could run, abandoning the cabin and trying to reach Ironwood Bluff before Cade caught them. But Naira's leg would not support extended travel, and running meant giving up defensive advantages. They could send for help, but the nearest law enforcement was Sheriff Garrett in Ironwood, and trusting the law meant risking the documents' confiscation before they reached the right authorities. Or we stand here and make him come to us. Marcus voiced the option both had been considering, but neither wanted to state directly. Fighting from prepared positions maximized their chances despite being outnumbered. The cabin offered cover-controlled approaches and supplies sufficient to outlast a siege if necessary. More importantly, running contradicted the choice Marcus made when he lifted the boulder. He would not abandon Naira to forces seeking to harm her. "I don't want you dying for me." Naira's protest carried weight, but Marcus heard the resignation behind it. She knew his decision was already made. "I'm not dying for you. I'm choosing what kind of man I am, what kind of man I want to be when I face whatever comes next. If that choice gets me killed, so be it." The fatalism in his voice matched his statement several days earlier. "We all die eventually, might as well choose how it happens." Naira searched his face for doubt or false bravery, finding only calm determination born from 5 years of thinking about the man he failed to be at Little Crow Creek. "Then we stand together." Her agreement formalized their alliance, transforming them from rescuer and rescued into partners facing shared danger. Marcus nodded once, accepting her commitment without attempting to dissuade her. She earned the right to fight for her own survival, and treating her as helpless would insult everything she had endured to reach this moment. The 7th day was devoted to final preparations. Marcus taught Naira basic rifle handling, compensating for her inexperience with firearms, through careful instruction about angles, breath control, and trigger discipline. She learned quickly, her natural coordination and hunting experience translating well to marksmanship. By afternoon, she could hit targets at 20 yards with reasonable consistency, enough to be useful in close-range defense. They established signals for communication during combat, specific words that meant reload, reposition, cease fire. Marcus showed her how to move between defensive positions using available cover, how to conserve ammunition, how to prioritize targets based on threat level. The instruction brought back memories of training new recruits during his cavalry days, except Naira's motivation exceeded any soldier's because her survival depended directly on applying these lessons. Evening brought unexpected calm. They prepared dinner together, Naira now mobile enough to help with cooking. The domestic normalcy felt surreal given their circumstances, but it also provided comfort. They ate slowly, savoring food that might be their last peaceful meal for days or weeks. Conversation drifted across neutral topics: childhood memories, favorite foods, places they had seen and hoped to see again. They carefully avoided discussing the coming confrontation, choosing instead to focus on life beyond immediate danger. After dinner, they sat on the porch watching stars emerge in the clear desert sky. The canyon stretched dark and mysterious before them, its familiar forms rendered strange by moonlight and shadow. Coyotes called from distant ridges, their voices rising and falling in eerie harmonies that made the night feel alive and dangerous. "Tell me something true." Naira's request came softly, barely audible above the night wind. Marcus considered what truth she sought, what piece of himself he could offer that would matter in the time they had remaining. "I came here to die. Not quickly, not dramatically, just to fade away from everything until nobody remembered I existed. I thought isolation would bring peace, or at least absence of pain. Instead, it brought emptiness deeper than any pain I'd known. He paused, gathering thoughts scattered across 5 years of solitude. Finding you changed that. Lifting that boulder meant something more than just saving a life. It meant choosing connection over isolation, action over paralysis, being someone rather than being no one. Oh. For the first time since Little Crow Creek, I felt like a man with purpose beyond simple survival. Naira absorbed his confession, understanding its significance. She reached across the space between their chairs and placed her hand over his, the gesture small but profound. Her palm was warm against his scarred skin, her touch gentle, despite the violence she had survived. I came to your canyon to die too. Not from choice like you, but from exhaustion and despair. When that boulder fell, I thought the world was finally finishing what it started at Split Rock. Then you appeared and refused to let me surrender. You gave me back something I thought was lost, the belief that maybe survival was worth the effort. She paused, searching for words adequate to the feeling. When you lifted that boulder, you didn't just save my body. You saved the part of me that remembers how to hope. That's a debt I can never repay because you gave me back my future. Marcus's throat tightened. He turned his hand over, interlacing his fingers properly with hers. Then we're even. Because you gave me back my past, not to relive it, but to reconcile with it. For 5 years, I've been half a man, half alive. You made me whole by giving me something worth protecting again. The words hung between them, too heavy for the moment, yet somehow exactly right. They sat holding hands while the night deepened around them, two people learning that wholeness sometimes came from two halves that complemented rather than completed each other. The moment stretched, filled with unspoken acknowledgments of connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. Neither spoke of love or permanent futures. Such luxuries belonged to people not facing imminent violence, but they recognized in each other a kind of kinship forged through shared trauma and mutual choosing. Eventually, the cold drove them inside. Marcus banked the fire and prepared his bedroll, noting that Naira watched him with an expression he could not quite read. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, whatever she wanted to say, apparently too risky to voice. Marcus understood. Words had power to make things real, and making things real created vulnerabilities neither could afford in their current situation. They settled into sleep positions, Marcus on his bedroll by the fire, Naira on the cot against the wall. But sleep came slowly, for both awareness of each other's presence filling the cabin's darkness like something tangible. Marcus listened to Naira's breathing, even out counting the intervals between inhalations and using the rhythm to anchor himself against the anxiety of waiting for violence he knew was coming. The eighth day dawned gray and cool clouds rolling in from the west, bringing the possibility of rain. Marcus woke early and immediately checked their perimeter, looking for new signs of observation or approach. He found nothing obvious, but the hair on his neck prickled with the sense of being watched. Cade was out there, he felt certain, probably studying the cabin through a telescope from some distant vantage point. He returned inside and shared his concerns with Naira. She had felt it too, that pressure of hostile attention, the intuition prey developed when predators drew near. They moved through morning routines with heightened alertness, both understanding the wait was nearly over. Around mid-morning, a rider appeared on the eastern rim, distant but visible, making no effort at concealment. Marcus retrieved his telescope and studied the figure. A man tall and lean, dressed in dark clothing with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. Even at distance, Marcus could see the confident posture of someone accustomed to violence and comfortable with risk. The man sat motionless for several minutes, openly studying the cabin, then turned his horse and disappeared back down the trail. Naira stood beside Marcus, her hand gripping the door frame with white-knuckled tension. That's him. That's Silas Cade. Marcus lowered the telescope and met her eyes. The time for preparation had ended. Now came the test of whether their preparations would prove sufficient. He's announced himself. That means he'll come for you soon, either alone or with others. We need to decide how to respond. Naira's jaw tightened with determination. Marcus recognized and respected. We don't respond. We wait. Let him make the first move, learn his plan from what he shows us. Then we counter. Marcus approved of her tactical thinking. Patience was often the difference between winning and losing, especially when outnumbered. They would let Cade reveal his intentions before committing to any course of action that might prove disadvantageous. The rest of the day passed in tense anticipation. Marcus and Naira maintained watch rotation, one always keeping eyes on approaches, while the other rested or attended to necessary tasks. The sun crawled across the sky with agonizing slowness, each hour feeling like three the waiting worse than action would be. Evening brought the sound of horses, multiple animals approaching from the direction where Kate appeared that morning. Marcus counted at least 4 riders, maybe 5, coming directly toward the cabin without attempt at stealth. Bold approach meant confidence, possibly overwhelming force. He positioned himself behind the reinforced door with Winchester ready, while Naira took a covered position by the window with the spare rifle Marcus maintained for emergencies. The riders stopped 50 yards from the cabin, just outside effective pistol range, but well within rifle distance. Cade Marcus recognized him from the earlier telescope, viewing dismounted and walked forward alone, hands held away from his in the universal gesture of temporary peace. His voice carried clearly across the distance when he spoke. Marcus Stone, I'm Silas Cade, working under federal contract to return escaped Apache prisoners to reservation custody. The woman you're harboring is property of the United States government wanted for escape and theft of military documents. Surrender her now and face no charges for aiding her. Refuse and you'll be treated as an accomplice to federal crimes. The formal legal language surprised Marcus. He expected threats or intimidation, not bureaucratic framing of the situation. Cade was attempting to use legitimate authority to force compliance, providing legal cover for what was essentially kidnapping. Marcus stepped onto the porch, keeping his Winchester pointed at the ground, but ready to raise it if needed. The woman's name is Naira, not property. She came here injured, and I provided medical assistance as any decent person would. I'm not harboring anyone. I'm exercising basic human kindness. As for your federal contract, I'd need to see documentation before I accepted your authority. Cade smiled without humor, appreciating the verbal sparring even while planning violence. My authority comes from Colonel Vernon Ashford of the Territorial Mining Commission, acting under War Department authorization. You want documentation? I'll be happy to provide it right before I put a rope around your neck for treason. You're a deserter, Stone. Walking away from Little Crow Creek made you a fugitive, and helping this woman makes you a traitor. The reveal of Marcus's deserter status was calculated to undermine any moral high ground he might claim. Cade clearly researched his target, learning everything necessary to press advantages. But the mention of Ashford's name confirmed what Naira's documents revealed. This was about protecting the colonel's conspiracy, not returning an escaped prisoner. If you're working for Ashford, then you're part of the massacre cover-up, which means this has nothing to do with law or federal authority and everything to do with protecting murderers from consequences. Marcus's counterattack landed solidly. Cade's expression flickered momentarily, calculations showing through his confident facade. Behind him, the other riders shifted uneasily, perhaps not fully aware of the situation's true nature. Cade recovered quickly, his smile returning with an edge. You can frame it however you like, Stone. Doesn't change the outcome. I'm taking the woman and those documents, and I'm taking them today. Only question is whether you die trying to stop me or live to face trial for your desertion. Marcus felt Naira's presence behind him in the doorway, felt her resolve matching his own. They had discussed this moment, planned for it, accepted its inevitability. Now came the moment of, you're not taking either. If you want a fight, we'll give you one. Marcus's voice dropped to something deeper, colder, carrying the weight of 5 years' exile. I spent 15 years as cavalry, and I know how to make every round count. You might take us eventually, but you'll pay for it in blood and bodies. Is Ashford paying you enough to die for him? He paused, letting the question sink in, then continued with quiet intensity. I stood at Little Crow Creek and refused an order to murder women and children. They chained me to a post for 3 days, debated hanging me, then gave me the choice to disappear. I chose exile over becoming a murderer. His eyes swept across Cade's men, meeting each gaze directly. Now I'm choosing again. I choose to stand here with this woman against men who hunt survivors of massacres orchestrated for profit. Following orders doesn't absolve us of conscience. Every man must draw his line somewhere, someplace where he says, I will not cross this no matter the cost. This is my line. Naira is my line. and you will not cross her to get to Ashford's crimes." The words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Cade's expression hardened, but Marcus saw uncertainty flicker across the faces of the men behind him. They had signed on for a manhunt, not a moral reckoning. "Judge me however you like. Call me traitor, deserter, fool. But when you stand before your God or your children, and they ask what you did when injustice came to your door, you'll have to answer for the choice you make tonight. I've made mine. Now make yours." The challenge shifted dynamics immediately. Cade's companions exchanged glances, reassessing their willingness to assault a fortified position defended by a former cavalry sergeant and an Apache woman with nothing to lose. More than that, they were reassessing whether they wanted to be remembered as the men who helped cover up genocide for a corrupt colonel's profit. Cade sensed their hesitation, and his expression hardened with anger at losing control of the confrontation. "You have until dawn tomorrow to reconsider. After that, we come in force and we don't show mercy." He remounted and led his group back toward the canyon rim, leaving Marcus and Naira to absorb the implications of his ultimatum. Dawn tomorrow meant approximately 12 hours to prepare for assault, to finalize defenses, to make peace with probable outcomes. Marcus and Naira retreated inside and barred the door. Both understanding the comfortable domesticity of the past week had ended. They were at war now, outnumbered and besieged, facing an enemy with resources and authorization that outweighed their moral position. The documents remained their only leverage, their only hope of turning this from a losing fight into something resembling victory. They spent the night in alternating watch, neither sleeping deeply, both listening for sounds that might signal early attack. The hours crawled past with agonizing slowness, each minute carrying the weight of potentially being their last peaceful moment. They did not speak much, conserving energy and maintaining alertness, but occasionally their eyes met across the firelit cabin, and understanding passed between them without words. As dawn approached, Marcus found himself thinking about choices and consequences, about the paths that led him to this moment, and the futures those paths prevented. 5 years ago, he chose conscience over duty at Little Crow Creek and lost everything he had built during his military career. A week ago, he chose compassion over safety when he lifted the boulder off Naira, and that choice brought him to this precipice where death seemed more likely than survival. Yet he felt no regret. Standing with Naira, preparing to face overwhelming force in defense of truth and justice, felt more right than anything he had done since putting on his sergeant's uniform. Perhaps this was his redemption, the chance to be the man he should have been at Little Crow Creek. Or perhaps it was simply foolish stubbornness, choosing to die for principle when pragmatism offered survival. Either way, Marcus Stone was done running. Naira watched the sun rise through the cabin's eastern window, painting the canyon walls in shades of amber and gold. The beauty felt incongruous with their situation life, continuing its patterns regardless of human violence and trauma. She thought about her family buried at Split Rock, about the 3 months she spent fleeing Cade's relentless pursuit, about the boulder that nearly ended her flight permanently. She thought about Marcus, this strange man who saved her life, and then refused to abandon her even when prudence screamed for him to cut his losses. His presence represented something she believed lost forever after Split Rock, the possibility that not all white men were enemies, that some few might choose justice over convenience. She did not love him exactly. There had been insufficient time for such complexity, but she recognized in him a kindred spirit, someone who understood trauma and chose resistance over surrender. If they died today, at least they would die standing rather than running. At least their deaths would mean something beyond being additional casualties in a war that seemed designed to erase her people from existence. The documents remained hidden, and even if Cade killed them both, eventually someone would find the evidence, and perhaps then the truth would matter. Dawn fully arrived, washing away the last shadows of night. Marcus and Naira took positions at window and door weapons, loaded and ready eyes scanning approaches for the assault they knew was coming. The canyon held its breath, waiting to see whether violence or reason would prevail in the ancient dance between predator and prey. Silas Cade appeared on the eastern rim exactly as the sun cleared the horizon, his timing theatrical and deliberate. He sat his horse in silhouette, a dark figure against the brightening sky, then slowly descended the trail toward the cabin. This time he came alone, his companions remaining out of sight, but undoubtedly positioned to support assault if negotiations failed. Marcus watched through his window finger, resting lightly on the Winchester's trigger, ready to fire if Cade made any hostile move. The tracker approached to within 30 yards and stopped studying the cabin with professional assessment. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly in the morning stillness. Last chance, Stone. Give me the woman and the documents. I'll let you live, might even put in a word about you being cooperative. Refuse and we burn you out. Your choice. Marcus stepped onto the porch, Naira appearing beside him, holding her rifle with competent readiness. They stood together, presenting unified front that transcended their recent acquaintance. Marcus's voice rang out strong and clear, carrying the authority of someone speaking final truth. My choice was made when I lifted a boulder off this woman and brought her to safety. I don't negotiate with men who hunt survivors of massacres orchestrated for profit. You want her, you'll have to come through me. Cade's expression shifted into something colder, calculation giving way to resolve. He had pushed as far as a negotiation would take him. Now came Violence's turn. He wheeled his horse and galloped back toward the rim, and Marcus knew the assault would come within minutes once Cade rejoined his men. Marcus and Naira retreated inside, securing the door and taking defensive positions. The cabin suddenly felt very small, very vulnerable, its thick walls insufficient protection against determined attack. They waited in tense silence, listening for sounds that would signal the beginning of the end. The attack came with shocking speed and force. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions simultaneously, bullets punching through the cabin's wooden walls and shattering the window glass. Marcus and Naira returned fire, methodically picking targets when attackers exposed themselves to shoot. The interior filled with gun smoke and splinters, the air itself seeming to fracture under the violence of repeated impacts. Marcus counted at least 6 attackers, more than Cade brought yesterday, suggesting he recruited additional guns from Ironwood Bluff or elsewhere. Professional gunmen moving with a coordination that spoke to experience in such assaults. They pressed the attack aggressively, forcing Marcus and Naira to expend ammunition faster than ideal to suppress incoming fire. A bullet grazed Marcus's left shoulder, tearing cloth and skin but missing bone. He ignored the pain, maintaining his firing position and placing shots with deliberate accuracy. Across the room, Naira worked her rifle with grim efficiency, her movements economical and precise despite her inexperience. She hit one attacker who exposed himself too long while reloading the man, screaming and falling back behind cover. The assault continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes before Cade called a temporary ceasefire. The sudden silence felt almost as violent as the gunfire ears ringing in the absence of sound. Marcus checked his ammunition, 12 rounds remaining for the Winchester 20 for his Colt, and realized they could not sustain another prolonged engagement. Naira's face was pale but determined, a cut on her cheek bleeding sluggishly. She met Marcus's eyes across the smoke-filled cabin, and he saw acceptance there, the understanding that they had hurt their attackers, but probably not enough to drive them off permanently. Cade's voice rang out from behind cover. You've made your point, Stone. You can fight, but you can't win. My men have you surrounded, and we have all day. Surrender now while you still can. Marcus considered their options, finding none that led to survival with freedom. They could surrender and hope for mercy they knew would not come. They could continue fighting until ammunition ran out and Cade's men overran their positions. Or they could attempt something desperate, a breakout that might fail but at least offered the possibility of escape. He looked at Naira, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her expression. She nodded once, understanding, without words, that desperate was their only option remaining. Marcus crossed quickly to the door, checking sightlines and approach routes. The attackers had positioned themselves well, covering all direct exits, but the canyon itself offered alternatives if they could reach it. The horses. Marcus spoke quietly, forming a plan even as he voiced it. If we can reach midnight and your mare, we might make it to the narrow passage before they can cut us off. Once in the passage, they can't surround us, and their numbers become liability rather than advantage. Naira absorbed the plan, identifying its weaknesses and strengths with tactical clarity. They'll shoot the horses if they see us mounting. Marcus nodded grimly. Smoke. We use the cabin. Set it burning, create cover while we run for the corral. They'll be focused on making sure we don't escape the fire. It was insane, the kind of plan that failed 9 times out of 10, but it was also their only realistic chance. Naira's expression showed she understood the odds and accepted them. Better to die trying to escape than to wait passively for death to arrive. They gathered minimal supplies, canteens, ammunition, the documents wrapped in oilcloth, and prepared for desperate flight. Marcus used his remaining lamp oil to create an accelerant splashing it across the cabin's interior with methodical care. When fire touched oil, the cabin would become inferno within minutes, creating exactly the kind of confusion they needed. Marcus positioned himself at the door while Naira crouched by the window, both ready to bolt when smoke provided cover. He struck a match and touched it to the oil-soaked floor near the back wall, watching flames spread with terrifying speed. Smoke rose immediately, thick and black, pouring through cracks in the walls and holes torn by bullets. The attackers saw smoke and shouted warnings, assuming Marcus and Naira were trapped inside. That brief moment of distraction was all they needed. Marcus kicked open the door and ran toward the corral, 30 yards distant, Naira limping fast behind him. Gunfire erupted again, bullets kicking up dirt around their feet, but the smoke obscured targeting and most shots went wide. They reached the corral as the cabin's roof caught fire, flames leaping toward the morning sky in brilliant orange columns. Marcus saddled Midnight with frantic speed while Naira worked on her smaller mare, both moving with adrenaline-fueled efficiency that shaved precious seconds from tasks that normally took minutes. They mounted and spurred their horses toward the canyon's narrow passage, bullets still whining past but losing accuracy as distance increased. The passage swallowed them, stone walls rising close on either side, cutting off sight lines and forcing their pursuers to follow single file if they wanted to continue chase. Marcus led with Midnight's speed, Naira close behind, both bent low over their horses' necks to present minimal targets. Behind them, Cade's voice screamed orders to follow, to cut them off, to prevent their escape at all costs. But the passage was Marcus's territory, memorized during 5 years of exploring every inch of Blackthorn Canyon. He knew the turns and splits, the places where passages doubled back or opened onto unexpected overlooks. He led Naira through a maze only he could navigate, confidently gaining distance on their pursuers with each confusing intersection. They emerged from the passage onto a high plateau overlooking the valley floor, the morning sun bright after the passage's shadows. Behind them, shouts echoed through the stone corridors as Cade's men struggled to follow their trail. Marcus reined Midnight to a halt and turned to survey their situation. The cabin burned in the distance, a pillar of smoke rising straight into the still air. Years of solitary work consumed in minutes, everything Marcus built reduced to ash and memory. He felt surprisingly little regret. The cabin was just a place, just wood and stone replaceable. What mattered was survival, was keeping Naira safe, was protecting the documents that could bring justice for Split Rock and Little Crow Creek. Naira pulled her mare alongside Midnight, breathing hard, face smudged with smoke and dirt. She met Marcus's eyes and smiled grimly, recognizing they had survived when survival seemed impossible. They were still being hunted, still facing overwhelming odds, but they were alive and together, and that counted for something. "We need to move. They'll track us eventually." Marcus nodded, already scanning the landscape for routes that would make pursuit difficult. The valley floor stretched below them, open and exposed suicide to cross in daylight with armed men following. But to the north, the plateau continued along the canyon rim, offering cover and concealment if they moved carefully. They rode north, maintaining alertness for any sign of pursuit. The plateau narrowed in places, forcing them close to the edge, where one misstep would send them tumbling hundreds of feet to the rocks below. They crossed these dangerous sections with careful concentration, trusting their horses to keep footing on treacherous terrain. By midday, they reached a point where the plateau descended into a series of rocky steps, leading down to a hidden valley Marcus remembered from previous explorations. The valley held a spring that ran year-round, providing water and supporting scrub vegetation sufficient to hide their presence if they were careful. They descended slowly, leading the horses when the trail became too steep for riding. The valley opened before them, small, and sheltered its spring, feeding a stream that meandered between stands of willow and cottonwood before disappearing underground. Marcus led them to a grove where trees provided cover from observation while still allowing clear sight lines to the valley entrance. They dismounted and tended the horses, then collapsed in exhausted relief. For several minutes, neither spoke, both processing what they had survived and what it cost. The cabin was gone, Marcus's refuge of 5 years erased. They were fugitives now, actively hunted by Cade and his men, with federal authority backing their pursuit. The documents remained their only leverage, their only hope of transforming this from a running battle into something resembling victory. Marcus examined his shoulder wound, finding it superficial despite the blood. Naira cleaned it with water from the spring and applied bandages using strips torn from her dress. Her hands moved with practiced competence, the touch gentle despite her own exhaustion and pain. When she finished, she sat back and met his eyes with an intensity that made Marcus's breath catch. Thank you. For everything. For lifting the boulder, for standing with me, for choosing this fight when you could have walked away. Marcus shook his head slowly. I didn't choose this fight. The fight was already happening, had been happening for years while I hid in my canyon, pretending the world's injustices weren't my concern. You just gave me reason to stop hiding and start fighting for something that matters. Naira reached out and took his hand, interlacing her fingers with his scarred ones. Whatever happens next, I'm grateful I found you. Even if we don't survive this, I'm grateful. Marcus squeezed her hand, acknowledging the sentiment without false promises about survival. They had crossed into territory where death was more probable than life, but at least they faced it together rather than alone. They spent the afternoon resting and planning their next moves. The documents needed to reach someone with authority to act on them, someone outside Ashford's influence. That meant traveling to Phoenix or even Santa Fe, both requiring days of travel through territory where Cade would certainly anticipate their movement. They needed allies' resources, anything that might shift the balance from overwhelming disadvantage towards something approaching even odds. Marcus remembered Sheriff Davis Garrett in Ironwood Bluff, the lawman who once served with him briefly during their cavalry days. Garrett was not corrupt as far as Marcus knew, possibly sympathetic to their cause if approached correctly. But reaching Ironwood meant moving closer to Cade's base of operations, potentially walking into another ambush. As evening approached, they heard riders in the distance, multiple horses moving through the valley entrance. Cade had tracked them faster than Marcus hoped, cutting off the time they needed to rest and recover. Marcus and Naira gathered their gear quickly and mounted, preparing to flee again. But Cade's voice stopped them. Stone, I know you're in there. Come out and let's talk like reasonable men. The offer surprised Marcus. Cade had shown no interest in negotiation before, only violent confrontation. Why change tactics now? Marcus studied the valley entrance through gathering dusk, counting at least 4 riders accompanying Cade. Still outnumbered, still at disadvantage, but Cade's willingness to talk suggested something had shifted in the equation. Marcus dismounted and helped Naira down, both taking defensive positions behind trees with clear lines of fire to the entrance. He called out without exposing himself. Talk from there. Say what you came to say. Cade emerged from the group, hands visible and empty, stopping at the valley's center, where both sides could see him clearly. His voice carried confidence, tinged with something else Marcus could not identify. You've made this harder than it needed to be, Stone. Burned your cabin, killed one of my men, cost me time and money. Colonel Ashford is not pleased. He's authorized me to make you an offer, surrender the documents, and the woman walks free. You'll face charges for desertion and aiding a fugitive, but she goes to the reservation alive and unharmed. The offer was calculated to divide them, to appeal to Marcus's protective instincts while painting Naira's future in terms that might seem acceptable compared to death. But Marcus heard the lies beneath the surface, knew Ashford would never allow Naira to live while she could testify about Split Rock. Cade continued when Marcus did not respond immediately. Or keep running and we kill you both. The colonel has resources you can't imagine, Stone. He owns territorial judges, has army officers in his pocket, controls the mining economy that keeps this territory functioning. You're one deserter and one Apache woman against the entire machinery of government and commerce. You cannot win. The words carried truth Marcus could not deny. They were outnumbered, outgunned, facing institutional power that crushed individuals who challenged it. Every logical calculation pointed toward inevitable defeat. But logic had stopped governing Marcus's decisions the moment he lifted a boulder off a woman who expected him to kill her. Your colonel is a murderer and you're his accomplice. The documents prove it, and eventually they'll reach someone who cares about justice more than profit. We're not surrendering, Cade. Do your worst. The defiance hung in the evening air like challenge issued before a duel. Cade stood silent for a long moment, then nodded slowly as if Marcus's response confirmed something he already expected. Then I'll see you in Hellstone. He withdrew to his men, and they vanished into the growing darkness, leaving Marcus and Naira to process what just happened. The offer was theater, Marcus realized, designed to let Cade claim he tried peaceful resolution before employing maximum violence. The real assault would come soon, probably at dawn when light favored attackers over defenders. They could not stay in the valley. It was a trap now with a single entrance Cade would certainly guard. They needed to move in darkness, using night to cover another desperate escape attempt. Marcus explained this to Naira, watching her process the implications and accept them with grim resolve. They mounted again and rode toward the valley's far end, where Marcus remembered a goat trail that switched back up the cliff face. The trail was treacherous even in daylight, potentially suicidal in darkness, but it offered their only escape route that Cade might not anticipate. They reached the trail's base and dismounted, preparing to lead the horses up sections too steep or narrow for riding. The climb took hours, each step requiring careful placement to avoid loose stones or gaps in the trail. The horses balked occasionally, sensing danger, requiring patient coaxing to continue upward. Below them, the valley lay dark and silent, Cade's men presumably waiting for dawn to spring their trap on prey who would not be present. They reached the rim as the moon rose, bathing the landscape in pale silver light. But instead of open plateau, Marcus found their path blocked by a rock slide that had not existed during his previous explorations. Recent rains must have triggered the collapsed tons of stone now covering the route he counted on for escape. Naira's mare stumbled, exhaustion finally overcoming the animal's formidable endurance. Marcus caught the bridle, steadying the horse, and made a quick assessment. Both horses were spent, their reserves depleted by hours of hard flight. Pushing them further in darkness over unfamiliar terrain would risk injury or death. We need shelter, somewhere defensible where we can rest until dawn. Marcus scanned the moonlit landscape, searching for options. His eyes caught on a dark opening in the cliff face 50 yards to the north, the entrance to one of the old silver mines that dotted this region. Most were abandoned decades ago, when the easy ore played out, but their tunnels remained, offering protection from weather and concealment from pursuit. They led the horses to the mine entrance, Marcus testing the tunnel's stability before committing. The timbers looked solid enough despite their age, and the shaft extended back into darkness beyond what moonlight revealed. He unsaddled the horses and hobbled them near the entrance, where they could access the sparse grass growing between rocks. Inside, the mine swallowed them in profound darkness. Marcus risked a small fire using deadfall gathered from outside, positioning it deep enough that the glow would not be visible from the canyon below, but close enough to the entrance that smoke could escape. The flames cast dancing shadows across rock walls marked with pickaxe scars and old drill holes. Naira collapsed near the fire, her leg clearly paining her after the desperate ride. Marcus examined it by firelight, finding the swelling had returned, though not as severely as before. She had pushed too hard too fast, and now her body demanded payment. He dampened a cloth with water from his canteen and applied it to her leg as a cold compress, then retrieved the willow bark she prepared back at his cabin. She chewed it mechanically, face tight with discomfort, while Marcus explored deeper into the mine. The tunnel extended perhaps 100 feet before ending in a collapsed section that blocked further passage. But along one wall, Marcus noticed something that made him pause, a wooden crate tucked into a carved alcove, hidden behind a loose rock that looked deliberately placed rather than naturally fallen. His curiosity overcoming caution, Marcus pried the crate free and carried it back to the firelight. The wood was old but had been protected from moisture by its concealment. He forced the lid open and found inside a collection of items that made his breath catch: military dispatches, handwritten letters, a leather-bound journal, and several official-looking documents tied with string. Naira moved beside him, her pain temporarily forgotten. "What is it?" Marcus lifted the journal and opened to the first page. The handwriting was neat, methodical, belonging to someone accustomed to keeping records. The name inscribed at the front made Naira gasp: Lieutenant James Brennan, 3rd Cavalry. He was real. Sarah's husband. He hid evidence before they killed him. Marcus flipped through the journal, his trained eye catching significant entries. Brennan had documented everything: dates of massacres, names of officers, involved specific orders from Colonel Ashford, financial transactions between mining companies, and territorial officials. It was a comprehensive record kept by someone who understood he was gathering evidence for a future reckoning he might not live to see. One entry stopped Marcus cold. It was dated 3 days after Little Crow Creek. Spoke today with Sergeant Marcus Stone, the man who refused Captain Harrison's orders to fire on the Apache lodges. Stone is currently in irons awaiting court-martial. He asked me to carry a message to his family if he hangs that he chose conscience over duty and regrets only that he failed to save more lives. I told him I would not deliver that message because I intended to help him escape before the trial. But Harrison learned of my plan and had me reassigned before I could act. Stone was given the choice to disappear, and I pray he took it. Men like him are too rare to lose to official murder. Marcus felt his vision blur. James Brennan had tried to help him 5 years ago, had risked his own position to save a fellow soldier who chose morality over orders. And Ashford's conspiracy had killed him for that decency just as it killed the Apache families at Split Rock and Little Crow Creek. There's more here. Financial records correspondence between Ashford and mining executives, proof of systematic genocide for profit spanning at least a decade. This is everything we need. Naira carefully examined each document, her hands trembling, as she recognized locations and dates that aligned with stories told by survivors of other massacres. The scope of Ashford's conspiracy became clear. Dozens of villages targeted hundreds of deaths, orchestrated all for mineral deposits and land speculation. But one document stood out from the rest, a letter from Ashford to a contact in Washington discussing the Apache problem and proposing a final solution: systematic elimination of all bands remaining off-reservation, followed by opening their territories to unrestricted mining and settlement. The letter was dated 6 months ago, suggesting the conspiracy was not just historical, but ongoing. This is their plan. They're not done. They're still hunting, still killing. Marcus understood the implications immediately. Naira's village was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger campaign that continued into the present. Every day they delayed exposing this evidence meant more deaths, more families destroyed. When we reach Phoenix, these documents combined with yours will be irrefutable. Ashford won't be able to buy or intimidate his way out of this much proof. They spent the next hours organizing the documents, creating a comprehensive record that told the full story of Ashford's conspiracy. The work was painstaking, but necessary. Federal officials would need clear evidence presented in logical sequence to understand the scope of crimes committed. As they worked, Naira found herself reading James Brennan's journal entries about his wife and children. His love for them saturated every page, and his anguish at leaving them unprotected was palpable in his final entries. He knew Ashford would kill him, knew his family would be told lies about his death, but he chose to document the truth anyway, hoping someone would eventually find his cache and finish what he started. He was brave, like Marcus, like the soldiers who refused immoral orders and paid with their careers or lives. Marcus heard the parallel she drew and felt the weight of it. He had spent 5 years thinking of himself as a failure, as someone who acted too late and accomplished too little. But James Brennan saw him differently, as someone who made the harder choice, who accepted punishment rather than participate in atrocity. Perhaps there was redemption in that after all. They rested in the mine through the remaining night hours, taking turns on watch, while the other slept fitfully. Marcus used the time to commit the document's contents to memory, preparing for scenarios where the physical evidence might be lost or destroyed. Naira did the same, her Apache training and oral tradition making her adept at memorizing precise details. Dawn crept into the mine entrance, gradually gray light replacing firelight. They packed the Brennan documents carefully alongside Naira's cache, creating a single comprehensive collection. Marcus felt the weight of it, not just physical, but historical. These papers represented years of suffering and death, but also the stubborn persistence of truth against systematic lies. As they emerged into morning light, Marcus took one last look at the mine that sheltered them. It was just another abandoned hole in the ground, indistinguishable from dozens of others dotting the territory. But it had served as vault for truth when truth needed protecting, and that gave it significance beyond its appearance. They mounted their rested horses and turned east toward Ironwood Bluff, carrying evidence that would ultimately topple an empire built on blood and gold. Before them stretched more canyon country, endless expanses of broken stone and hidden passages. Behind them, somewhere in the darkness, Cade and his men hunted with resources and authority that made this flight feel futile, even while necessary. Marcus looked at Naira, seeing exhaustion and determination mixing in her expression. They had been running for 12 hours straight, fighting and fleeing and surviving moment by moment. The pace could not continue indefinitely. Eventually, exhaustion or luck would fail them. They needed a different strategy, something beyond running, or they would die tired in some nameless canyon far from anyone who might remember them. An idea formed as Marcus stared across the moonlit landscape. Ironwood Bluff lay 30 miles east, reachable by morning if they rode through the night. Sheriff Garrett was there, potentially an ally, if Marcus could reach him and convince him to act on the documents. It was risky, possibly walking directly into Cade's hands, but it offered something. Running. Could not the possibility of ending this chase rather than merely prolonging it? Marcus explained his thinking to Naira, watching her evaluate the proposal with her characteristic tactical clarity. She recognized the risks, but also the logic. They could not run forever, and every hour spent fleeing was an hour where Cade's resources and organization grew stronger. Better to force confrontation on ground of their choosing with potential allies than to wait until exhaustion made them helpless. We ride for Ironwood. Naira's agreement formalized the decision. They would gamble everything on reaching Garrett before Cade anticipated their move, on convincing the sheriff to act against a powerful colonel who probably owned half the territory's officials. It was desperation masquerading as strategy, but desperation was all they had left. They rode through the night, pushing the horses as hard as they dared without risking injury. The landscape rolled past in endless variations of stone and shadow, familiar yet strange under moonlight. Marcus navigated by stars and memory, following trails he had learned during his years of isolation. Naira rode beside him, silently conserving energy, trusting his knowledge of the terrain. Dawn found them within sight of Ironwood Bluff, the town appearing on the eastern horizon as the sun rose behind them. Smoke from breakfast fires drifted skyward, domestic normalcy proceeding, oblivious to the violence being played out in the surrounding canyons. Marcus felt a complex mixture of relief and dread as they approached. They had reached their destination, but now came the harder task of converting arrival into victory rather than capture. They rode directly to the sheriff's office, choosing boldness over caution. Garrett would either help them or arrest them, but skulking around town would only delay that determination while increasing risk of discovery by Cade's allies. Marcus dismounted and helped Naira down, both moving stiffly after the night's ride. He led her toward the office door, hand resting on his Colt, ready for whatever came next. Sheriff Davis Garrett looked up from his desk as they entered, his expression cycling through surprise, recognition, and concern in rapid succession. He was a solid man in his 50s, weathered face carrying the weight of years, trying to maintain order in territory where violence was common and justice rare. His eyes took in their appearance, dirty, exhausted, blood-stained, and settled into a wariness that suggested he already knew trouble had arrived. "Marcus Stone, heard you were dead or gone buried somewhere in Blackthorn Canyon where nobody would find you." Garrett's voice carried no judgment, only statement of fact. Marcus met his eyes, steadily gambling that the man he remembered from their cavalry days still existed beneath the sheriff's badge. "I'm alive, Davis, and I need your help. This is Naira. She's carrying evidence of mass murder and conspiracy that reaches high into the territorial government. We're being hunted by Silas Cade, working on behalf of Colonel Vernon Ashford. If you're the man I remember, the one who walked away from bad orders at Fort Davis, then I'm asking you to stand with us. If you're not that man anymore, then arrest us now and get it over with." The directness of Marcus's appeal left no room for equivocation. Garrett studied them both for a long moment, his hand resting near, but not on his holstered pistol. When he spoke, his voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had made too many compromises and was tired of the taste. "Show me this evidence." Marcus nodded to Naira, who produced the documents from beneath her torn dress. Garrett read them slowly, his expression growing darker with each page. When he finished, he set the papers down carefully and looked at Marcus with something approaching respect. "Jesus Christ. Ashford did this, orchestrated massacres for mining rights." Marcus nodded. "Split Rock, Little Crow Creek, a dozen other villages, all targeted because surveyors found gold or silver on Apache land. The orders came directly from Ashford, using War Department authorization he doesn't actually have. He's been selling confiscated land to mining companies and keeping the profits." Garrett stood and paced his small office, thinking through implications and options. When he turned back to face them, his jaw was set with determination Marcus remembered from Fort Davis. "I believe you. More importantly, I believe these documents. But you need to understand what you're asking. Ashford owns half the territorial judges and has the Army's support because he's connected in Washington. Taking him on means taking on the whole corrupt system he represents." Marcus had heard similar arguments at Little Crow Creek when he objected to Harrison's orders. He had heard them again a week ago when logic insisted he should abandon Naira to avoid complications. The arguments never changed, only the names and circumstances, and Marcus was done listening to reasonable voices that explained why injustice was inevitable. I understand perfectly, Davis, and I'm asking anyway. These people deserve justice, and Naira deserves protection. Are you going to help us, or do I need to find someone who will? The challenge hung between them, former comrades, facing the question of who they had become in the years since they wore cavalry blue. Garrett's face worked through internal conflict, decades of compromise, warring with the ideals that originally led him to law enforcement. Finally, he reached a decision that showed in the straightening of his shoulders and the hardening of his eyes. I'll help. But we do this smart, not heroic. Ashford has resources we lack, so we need leverage. First priority is keeping you and those documents safe until we can get them to someone outside Ashford's influence. That means Santa Fe Territorial Capital, where federal marshals can override local corruption. Marcus felt tension ease slightly in his chest. They had an ally, someone with authority and local knowledge who could help navigate the political complexities they faced. The odds remained terrible, but at least they were not facing them completely alone. Garrett continued thinking aloud. You'll stay here in the jail where I can protect you. I'll send word to Santa Fe requesting federal assistance, explaining the situation and the evidence you're carrying. With luck, a marshal arrives within a week, and we transfer custody of the documents under proper legal protection. Naira spoke for the first time since entering the office, her voice carrying skepticism Marcus shared. And when Cade comes looking for us, he'll know we came here. He'll bring his men and demand you hand us over. Garrett smiled grimly. Then I tell him you're under protective custody pending federal investigation. If he wants to try taking you from my jail, he's welcome to discover what happens when someone assaults a territorial sheriff in performance of his duties. The plan was simple but solid, relying on Garrett's authority and the principle that even corrupt officials hesitated to openly assault law enforcement. It was not foolproof. Cade might decide to burn the jail just as he burned Marcus's cabin, but it gave them their best chance of surviving long enough for help to arrive. They spent the remainder of the day in the jail's single cell, technically prisoners, but actually protected guests. Garrett brought them food and water, allowed them to clean up properly for the first time in days, and even procured clean clothing to replace their ruined garments. The normalcy felt strange after the past week's violence, but Marcus and Naira accepted it gratefully. As evening fell, they heard horses in the street outside, multiple riders moving with purpose, stopping directly in front of the jail. Marcus recognized Cade's voice demanding to speak with the sheriff. Garrett stepped outside, closing the door behind him, and Marcus could hear muffled conversation through the walls. The exchange grew heated, Cade's voice rising with anger, while Garrett remained level and firm. Finally, Garrett's voice cut through the argument with finality. You want them? Bring me a federal warrant signed by a judge I recognize as legitimate. Until then, they're under protective custody and you've got no authority over my prisoners. Now clear out before I arrest you for interfering with an investigation. Silence followed, weighted and dangerous. Then hoofbeats as Cade and his men departed, the sound fading into the distance, but not disappearing entirely. Marcus knew Cade would not give up easily, would find other ways to apply pressure or force the situation. They had bought time but not safety. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor. Marcus woke to the sound of a woman's voice in Garrett's office, her tone measured but insistent. He sat up on his cot and listened through the cell bars as the conversation unfolded. I know they're here, Davis. The whole town knows, and I'm here to help, not hinder. Garrett's response came wary, protective. Sarah, you need to stay out of this. Cade is dangerous, and Ashford has long reach. Getting involved will only paint a target on your back. The woman, Sarah, laughed without humor. I've had a target on my back for 3 years. Ever since James died trying to stop what happened at Split Rock. The only difference is I've been too frightened to do anything about it until now. Marcus exchanged glances with Naira, seeing recognition dawn in her expression. She moved to the cell door, gripping the bars. Split Rock, your husband was there. The conversation in the office stopped abruptly. Footsteps approached, and a woman appeared in the doorway between office and cells. She was perhaps 40, dressed in the practical clothing of a frontier widow, her face lined with grief, but her eyes sharp with determination. She studied Naira with an intensity that made Marcus tense, ready to intervene if hostility followed recognition. But Sarah's expression softened instead of hardening. You're one of the survivors. I can see it in your eyes, the same look James had when he came home that last time. He told me what he witnessed, what the cavalry did under Ashford's orders. He said he tried to stop it, tried to get the other soldiers to refuse the command. Naira's hands trembled on the bars. I don't remember all the soldiers. I was hiding. But there was one who shouted, who tried to intervene before they shot him. Sarah's breath caught her composure cracking. They told me he was killed by Apache raiders. That's the official report. But James wrote me a letter before he died, told me the truth. Ashford had him murdered because he threatened to report the massacre. Made it look like combat casualties. She reached into her dress pocket and withdrew a folded envelope, its edges worn from repeated handling. He hid evidence before they killed him. Documents, correspondence proof that Ashford orchestrated Split Rock and planned more. I've carried these for 3 years, too terrified to use them because I have children to protect. But I heard you have documents too, that you're taking the fight to Ashford. And I realized James died trying to do the right thing. The least I can do is finish what he started. Garrett unlocked the cell door, allowing Sarah to enter. She handed the envelope to Naira, who opened it with reverent care. Inside were military dispatches, letters bearing Ashford's signature, financial records showing payments to cavalry officers for special assignments near Apache territories. Marcus read over Naira's shoulder, his mind racing. These documents corroborated what they already possessed, but they also filled gaps, names of other officers involved, specific payment amounts, dates that aligned perfectly with reported massacres. Combined with Naira's documents, this was an airtight case. Why now? Why come forward after 3 years? Sarah met Marcus's question with steady conviction. Because I heard Cade threaten to burn down the jail. Because I watched this town turn coward when confronted with the truth. Because my children deserve to grow up in a territory where justice means something more than protecting powerful men's profits. She turned to Naira, her voice dropping to something more intimate. And because the women and children who died at Split Rock deserve more than silence. James gave his life trying to speak for them. The least I can do is add my voice. Naira embraced Sarah suddenly, fiercely, the two women holding each other in shared grief and shared purpose. Marcus felt his throat tighten, watching them, two widows, one literal and one in spirit, finding solidarity in tragedy. Garrett cleared his throat awkwardly. Sarah, this makes you a material witness. Ashford will come for you too once he learns you have evidence. Sarah straightened, releasing Naira but keeping one hand on her shoulder. Then I'll testify alongside these two. Let him try to silence all of us. Maybe enough voices together will finally be heard. The moment crystallized something Marcus had not quite grasped before. This was not just his fight or Naira's fight. It was a fight that had been building for years, accumulating witnesses and victims, and people finally reaching the breaking point where silence became more dangerous than speaking. Sarah's presence transformed their desperate gamble into something larger. A movement small but growing of people refusing to accept injustice as inevitable. Garrett made his decision. All right, the 3 of you stay here under my protection until we can reach Phoenix. But Sarah, you need to get your children to somewhere safe. If Ashford's men come, I don't want them anywhere near the crossfire. Sarah nodded. They're already at my sister's ranch, 2 territories away. I sent them the day I heard about your fugitives. I knew what I was going to do, knew the risks. She looked at Marcus and Naira with something approaching gratitude, mixed with grim determination. We're going to end this. For James, for your families, for all the people whose names nobody remembers, because powerful men erase them. Justice delayed but not denied. That night, Marcus and Naira lay on separate cots in the cell, exhaustion finally catching up to adrenaline. They talked quietly about what came next, about the hope that federal marshals would arrive before Ashford found ways to corrupt or delay the process. They talked about what they would do if they survived, what kind of future might exist beyond this immediate crisis. Naira admitted she had no idea where she belonged anymore. Split Rock was ashes, her family gone, the traditional Apache way of life being systematically destroyed by expansion and violence. Marcus understood her rootlessness, having spent 5 years himself trying to find purpose after losing his identity as a soldier. They recognized in each other a shared state of being unmade, of having who they were torn away and being forced to construct new selves from wreckage. Perhaps we build something together. Once this is over, if we survive, maybe we find somewhere that's neither Apache nor white, somewhere that lets us be who we choose to be rather than who others insist we must be. Marcus's suggestion was tentative, an offering rather than demand. Naira considered it silently before responding. I would like that. To stop running, to stop being hunted, to just exist without constantly fighting for the right to survive. Yes, I would like that very much. The conversation drifted into comfortable silence, both of them processing the fragile possibility of futures beyond mere survival. Sleep came eventually, true rest for the first time in days, secure in the knowledge that Garrett's presence provided at least temporary protection from immediate danger. 2 days passed peacefully, an unexpected gift of normalcy, while they waited for federal response. Garrett reported that he sent multiple telegrams to Santa Fe explaining the situation and requesting immediate assistance. The replies he received were non-committal, suggesting bureaucratic wheels were turning, but not with the urgency the situation demanded. On the third day, trouble arrived in the form of a telegram to Garrett from territorial headquarters. The message was brief and devastating. Sheriff Garrett was suspended pending investigation into charges of harboring federal fugitives. His authority was temporarily transferred to a deputy appointed by the territorial governor, who happened to be a close associate of Colonel Ashford. Garrett showed Marcus the telegram, his expression grim. They're moving to cut me off, probably planning to install someone who will hand you over to Cade without question. The new deputy arrives tomorrow morning. After that, I won't have authority to protect you. Marcus absorbed this news, feeling the trap closing around them again. They had gambled on Garrett's protection and on federal intervention arriving in time, but Ashford proved faster and more ruthless than they anticipated. The colonel was willing to corrupt entire chains of command to protect his conspiracy, which meant conventional appeals to authority were doomed to fail. Then we leave tonight, before your replacement arrives and while we still have freedom of movement. Naira's suggestion was practical, but raised new problems. They were back to being fugitives without protection or resources. The documents remained their leverage, but leverage was useless without someone to apply it against who had both authority and integrity. Garrett shook his head. Running won't solve anything. Ashford will keep hunting you, keep using his influence to block investigation. You need to force the issue publicly, make it impossible for him to suppress the evidence without exposing himself. But how? Marcus asked the question they were all thinking. How could two fugitives force confrontation with a powerful colonel protected by institutional corruption? Garrett paced his office, thinking hard. When he spoke, his plan was desperate but offered something beyond mere flight. Tomorrow morning, when the new deputy arrives, you'll be gone. But you won't be running. You'll be at the territorial governor's office in Phoenix presenting these documents directly to federal representatives who happen to be meeting there about Apache policy. I'll spread word that you escaped during the night, buying you time to reach Phoenix before Cade realizes where you've gone. The plan was risky, relying on precise timing and the hope that federal representatives would prove less corrupt than territorial officials. But it offered the possibility of ending their flight rather than merely extending it, of forcing the evidence into public view, where suppression became exponentially more difficult. Marcus and Naira agreed to Garrett's plan, recognizing they had few alternatives. They spent the remaining daylight preparing supplies and planning their route to Phoenix. Garrett provided fresh horses, weapons, and a letter of introduction to a federal Indian agent he claimed was honest and sympathetic to Apache causes. Whether the claim was accurate remained to be seen, but it gave them a concrete target to reach. They left Ironwood Bluff 2 hours before midnight, Garrett insisting on earlier departure, after receiving word that Cade's men were gathering at the town's edge. Sarah accompanied them, refusing to stay behind when her evidence was essential to the case. The four of them moved quietly through back streets, leading their horses to avoid noise. But Cade anticipated the escape. The ambush came at the canyon mouth, where the trail narrowed between high rock walls, the only route toward Phoenix that did not require days of detour. Gunfire erupted from both sides of the passage, muzzle flashes bright in the darkness. Marcus's horse screamed and went down, throwing him hard against the rocky ground. He rolled behind the fallen animal, using his body as cover, while returning fire toward the shadowed positions above. Naira and Sarah scattered to opposite sides of the trail, finding shelter behind boulders. Garrett's horse bolted back toward town, leaving the sheriff on foot and exposed in the center of the killing ground. Marcus saw Cade's men closing in, preparing to finish Garrett where he stood. To me, Marcus laid down, covering fire, forcing the attackers to duck while Garrett sprinted for Marcus's position. Bullets kicked up dirt at the sheriff's heels, one round clipping his shoulder and spinning him partially around. But he kept moving, diving behind the dead horse as Marcus emptied his Winchester toward the cliff tops. This was professionally planned. Cade knew we'd come this way. Garrett pressed a hand to his wounded shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. He probably has men on the Phoenix Road too. We're boxed. From her position across the trail, Naira called out, "There's another way, old Apache trail through the Slot Canyon to the north. Narrow but passable for horses." A new voice joined the firefight, deeper, colder, carrying the confidence of someone who had already won. Silas Cade stepped into view on the high ground, rifle aimed down at their position, but not firing. Behind him, Marcus counted at least 8 men with weapons ready. "Clever of you to attempt the escape, Stone, but I've been hunting people through this territory for 20 years. You think I don't know every trail, every passage, every route someone might try when desperate?" He gestured to his men, and several moved to block the Slot Canyon. Naira indicated. The trap was complete high ground behind them, men blocking the only escape routes, darkness limiting their vision, while their attackers had position and numbers. "You have 2 options: surrender now and I'll let the women live to stand trial. Or keep fighting and I'll kill all 4 of you and burn the documents with your bodies. Nobody will ever know you were here," and Ashford's enterprise continues without interruption. Marcus checked his ammunition, 6 rounds remaining for his Colt, his Winchester empty. Across the trail, he could see Naira and Sarah in similar straits, their initial volleys having depleted their supplies. Garrett's rifle lay somewhere in the darkness, lost when he dove for cover. They were outgunned, outpositioned, and out of options. But Marcus had not survived 15 years of cavalry combat by accepting defeat when cornered. He looked at the terrain with tactical clarity, identifying the single advantage they possessed. Cade's men were clustered on the high ground, making them vulnerable to a specific type of counterattack if executed perfectly. "Davis, can you shoot with that shoulder?" Garrett tested his range of motion, grimacing but nodding. "Well enough at close range." Marcus spoke quickly, outlining a desperate plan that relied on precise timing and enormous luck. The idea was insane, the kind of tactic that got soldiers killed when it failed, but it offered their only realistic chance. Cade was still talking, giving them time to accept the inevitable, when Marcus set the plan in motion. He fired 3 quick shots at the canyon wall behind Cade's position, not aiming at men, but at the rock face itself. The bullets sparked against stone, providing both distraction and illumination of enemy positions. In that moment of light, Naira and Sarah opened fire from their positions, targeting not the men themselves, but the loose scree beneath their feet. The dry rockfall gave way under the impact, starting small landslides that forced Cade's men to scramble for stable footing. Garrett used the chaos to sprint across the open ground toward the cliff face where a narrow climber's path offered access to the high ground. Marcus provided covering fire with his remaining rounds, each shot placed to create maximum disruption rather than seeking kills. The plan worked because it violated every expectation Cade had about their capabilities. He anticipated surrender or hopeless resistance, not a coordinated assault that exploited terrain weaknesses. His men hesitated, surprised by prey that suddenly became predators. Marcus reached Garrett's position and boosted the sheriff up onto the climber's path. Garrett pulled himself upward with his good arm, using rock holds Marcus identified by moonlight. Below them, Cade was screaming orders, trying to reorganize his scattered men, but the momentum had shifted. Garrett reached the high ground behind Cade's position and opened fire with his recovered rifle. The reversal was complete. Attackers became targets. Hunters became hunted. Cade's men broke under the unexpected assault from above, running for their horses and fleeing into the night. But Cade himself did not run. He advanced on Marcus's position with methodical determination, rifle raised, face contorted with professional pride, refusing to accept failure. His first shot missed as Marcus dove sideways, rolling behind a boulder. His second shot struck the rock inches from Marcus's head, showering him with stone fragments. Marcus fired his last round, catching Cade in the leg and sending him sprawling. But the tracker kept coming, drawing a knife, closing the distance between them with the focused intensity of someone who had killed many men in close quarters. They met in brutal collision, Marcus catching Cade's knife arm while taking a punch to the ribs that cracked bone. They grappled on the rocky ground, each seeking advantage, each understanding this was a fight only one would survive. Cade was younger, faster, uninjured. But Marcus had rage fueling him, 5 years of guilt and grief transformed into focused violence. Marcus got his arm around Cade's throat and locked it in a stranglehold. The tracker thrashed, driving his knife backward into Marcus's thigh. But Marcus held on through the pain, squeezing with everything he had. Cade's struggles weakened his movements, becoming uncoordinated. Finally, he went limp, the knife falling from nerveless fingers. Marcus released him and staggered back, breathing hard, blood soaking his leg where the knife pierced muscle. Cade lay motionless, unconscious, but alive. Marcus could have killed him, probably should have killed him, but some part of him refused to execute an unconscious man. Let federal marshals handle Cade's fate. Garrett descended from his position, supporting his wounded shoulder. Naira and Sarah emerged from cover, both shaken but uninjured. The four of them stood in the aftermath, surveying the battlefield, where they had somehow survived despite overwhelming odds. We need to move. Cade's men will return with reinforcements once they regroup. They gathered what supplies survived the firefight, commandeered horses from those Cade's men left behind, and set off toward Phoenix at a pace that balanced speed against the wounded's limitations. Behind them, Cade began stirring, groaning back toward consciousness. Marcus considered restraining him, but decided the delay was too risky. They needed distance more than they needed prisoners. The ride through the remaining night hours was grim and silent, each of them processing how close they had come to death. But they had survived, and more importantly, they still possessed the documents. The fight at the canyon mouth had cost them, but had not defeated them. That had to count for something. Dawn found them approaching Phoenix's outskirts, four battered people carrying evidence that would topple empires. They looked like refugees from a war, bloodied, exhausted, half dead from pursuit, which Marcus reflected was exactly what they were. Refugees from a war fought in shadows where the enemy wore respectable uniforms and signed massacre orders with official seals. But they were refugees who had survived, who had fought back, who refused to let power and corruption win through intimidation. That made them more than victims. It made them witnesses who could not be silenced. The ride to Phoenix took 2 days of hard travel, pushing through territory that grew more populated as they approached the capital. They avoided main roads, traveling cross-country when possible, always alert for signs of pursuit. Twice they spotted riders in the distance and detoured widely to avoid contact, unable to determine whether the figures were coincidental travelers or Cade's men searching for them. Phoenix appeared on the afternoon of the second day, a sprawling town of adobe and wood buildings clustered around the territorial capital complex. The town represented civilization's encroachment into desert wilderness, bringing commerce and law and all the corruption that followed when profit-motivated policy. Marcus studied the town from a distant hilltop, mapping approaches and escape routes out of habit. Naira sat beside him, her expression unreadable as she contemplated the place where her fate would be decided. She had avoided white settlements since escaping from the transport wagon, knowing they represented danger and potential recapture. Now she was choosing to ride directly into the heart of territorial power gambling, everything on documents, in the fragile hope that someone might care about justice for murdered Apache families. Whatever happens, I'm grateful you were with me for this. Her words carried finality that made Marcus's chest tighten. He understood she was preparing for the possibility that this was their last ride together, that Phoenix might end in her capture, or his death, or both. He wanted to reassure her, to promise success and survival, but he had learned years ago that some promises could not be kept honestly. We'll get through this. One way or another, we'll see justice done for your people. The promise he did make was about purpose rather than outcome, about fighting for what mattered regardless of consequences. Naira smiled slightly, recognizing the distinction and appreciating it more than false reassurance would have warranted. They rode into Phoenix as evening fell, timing their arrival to coincide with the end of business day, when government offices would be closing and crowds thinning. Marcus led them directly to the Capitol building, a substantial adobe structure flying the territorial flag. Guards stood at the entrance, but they were ceremonial rather than military, elderly men whose primary function was deterring vandalism rather than defending against armed assault. Marcus dismounted and helped Naira down, both moving with the stiffness of days spent in the saddle. He approached the guards directly, gambling that honest confrontation would work better than attempted stealth. I'm Marcus Stone, formerly sergeant in the Territorial Cavalry. This is Naira of the Split Rock Apache Band. We're carrying evidence of federal crimes committed by Colonel Vernon Ashford, and we need to speak immediately with the highest-ranking federal official currently in this building. The guards exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unprepared for such direct approach. One disappeared inside while the other kept Marcus and Naira in view without openly threatening them. Minutes passed in tense silence, broken finally by the first guard's return with a middle-aged man in a civilian suit who carried the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "I'm Thomas Brennan, Assistant Territorial Secretary. You claim to have evidence of federal crimes?" His tone was skeptical but not dismissive, suggesting he was at least willing to listen before rejecting their claims. Marcus produced the documents and offered them without preamble. Proof that Colonel Ashford orchestrated massacres of Apache villages were to seize land for mining development. Orders correspondence and financial records showing systematic genocide motivated by profit. Read them and you'll understand why we're being hunted by federal marshal operating on Ashford's behalf. Brennan took the documents and read them in the fading light, his expression growing darker with each page. When he finished, he looked up at Marcus and Naira with an intensity that suggested he understood the implications completely. These are legitimate military documents. If authentic, they prove conspiracy to commit mass murder and abuse of federal authority on a scale that would disgrace the entire territorial administration. He paused, studying their faces carefully. Why bring them to me instead of federal marshals? Because Ashford's corruption runs deep enough that we don't know who we can trust. Your territorial secretary appointed by Washington, theoretically outside the local power structure he controls. If you're honest, you can get these documents to people in Washington who can't be bought or intimidated. If you're corrupt too, then we're probably about to die. That's our gamble. The blunt honesty seemed to affect Brennan more than any appeal to justice might have. He made a decision that showed in the straightening of his shoulders. Come inside. There are people you need to meet, and these documents need to be copied and telegraphed to Washington tonight. If what you're saying is true, Colonel Ashford is finished. The only question is how many others fall with him. Marcus and Naira followed Brennan into the Capitol building, passing through halls lined with territorial history rendered in portraits and plaques celebrating pioneers and progress. The contrast between official narrative and the truth in their documents felt almost grotesque, this sanitized version of expansion omitting the blood required to achieve it. Brennan led them to a conference room where three men waited, introduced as representatives from Washington's Bureau of Indian Affairs, conducting investigation into reservation administration. Marcus felt hope kindle in his chest. These were exactly the officials they needed to reach people with authority outside territorial control who might actually care about systematic abuse of Apache populations. Brennan explained the situation while the officials read the documents with growing alarm. Questions followed, sharp and probing, testing the authenticity of the evidence and Marcus and Naira's credibility as witnesses. Marcus answered with military precision, providing context and corroboration for everything the documents claimed. Naira spoke less, but with devastating emotional impact when she described Split Rock's destruction and the 3 months she spent fleeing Cade's pursuit. By midnight, the officials had copied the documents and drafted a telegram to the Secretary of Interior explaining the situation and requesting immediate federal intervention. The telegram was sent priority, which meant it would reach Washington within hours and prompt action would follow within days. Ashford's conspiracy was beginning to unravel, pulled apart by the evidence he had tried so desperately to suppress. But success brought new danger. Word of their presence in Phoenix would spread quickly, reaching Ashford and Cade probably before morning. The colonel would understand he faced exposure and ruin, which made him exponentially more dangerous. Desperate men did desperate things, and Ashford had resources sufficient to mount a final attempt to silence witnesses before federal authority arrived to protect them. Brennan recognized this reality and ordered armed guards stationed outside the conference room, where Marcus and Naira would spend the night under protective watch. The guards were federal employees rather than territorial, chosen specifically because they were outside Ashford's chain of command. It was not perfect security, but it was better than facing the night undefended. Marcus and Naira sat together in the conference room after the officials departed, exhaustion finally overwhelming them. They had accomplished their goal, delivered the documents to people who could act on them, set in motion the wheels of justice that would eventually crush Ashford and everyone who helped him. But Marcus felt no triumph, only weary relief that the running was finally over. Naira leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, and Marcus wrapped his arm around her in protective embrace. They had survived together, fought together, gambled everything together, and somehow won. The future remained uncertain. Federal investigations took time, and Ashford might yet find ways to escape consequences, but at least they had forced him into reactive position rather than hunting from strength. We did it. Naira's whisper carried wonder and disbelief in equal measure. Marcus squeezed her shoulder gently. You did it. You kept those documents safe for 3 months while Kate hunted you. You survived the boulder and trusted a stranger to help you. This victory is yours more than mine. Naira lifted her head and looked at him with eyes that held depth of feeling Marcus recognized as matching his own. She leaned forward slowly, giving him time to pull away if he wished, then kissed him gently. The kiss was brief but profound acknowledgement of everything they had shared and everything they might yet share if they survived what came next. When they separated, Marcus found himself smiling for the first time in what felt like years. They were damaged people, both carrying trauma that would never fully heal, but perhaps damage could find wholeness when two broken pieces fit together properly. The thought felt like possibility, like hope, like the beginning of something worth building. They spent the night in the conference room, sleeping fitly on chairs pushed together into makeshift beds. Guards maintained watch outside their presence, providing security that allowed both Marcus and Naira to actually rest despite circumstances. Morning arrived with sunlight streaming through the high windows, painting the room in golden light that felt like blessing. Brennan appeared early with news federal marshals were en route from Fort Bliss, expected to arrive within 2 days. Until then, Marcus and Naira would remain under protective custody in the Capitol building, where Brennan could ensure their safety. More importantly, Ashford had been summoned to Phoenix to answer questions about the documents his presence required before he could flee to Mexico or farther east, where his connections might protect him from prosecution. The summons represented endgame. Ashford would either comply and face interrogation that would destroy him, or he would flee and confirm his guilt through cowardice. Either outcome meant the beginning of justice for Split Rock and Little Crow Creek and all the other villages that burned in service to his greed. But Ashford chose a third option that no one anticipated, and he came to Phoenix with every gunman and corrupt official he could muster, prepared to assault the Capitol itself rather than surrender to investigation. The attack came at dawn. On the second day, dozens of armed men surrounding the building and demanding custody of Marcus and Naira. Brennan refused, standing in the Capitol's entrance with federal guards backing him, explaining that the witnesses were under federal protection and could not be surrendered to territorial authority. Ashford himself appeared resplendent in his colonel's uniform, despite having no active military commission, fury evident in every line of his body. Those people are fugitives and liars, spreading false accusations to undermine legitimate territorial governance. Hand them over or be charged with obstruction of justice and harboring criminals. Ashford's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to obedience, but Brennan did not flinch. The documents they provided are legitimate military records bearing your signature. The federal government is investigating charges of genocide and conspiracy. You have no authority here, Colonel, and I'm ordering you to disperse before I have you arrested for attempting to interfere with federal proceedings. The standoff crystallized armed men facing armed men while townspeople gathered to watch. Marcus and Naira stood behind Brennan, visible through the doorway symbols of everything at stake in this confrontation. The crowd murmured, processing the accusations being thrown back and forth, beginning to understand the implications of documents proving massacre for profit. Silas Cade stood beside Ashford, hand resting on his pistol, eyes locked on Naira with the intensity of someone whose professional reputation depended on completing this one final task. Marcus met his stare, reading murder in Cade's expression, understanding that the tracker would attempt violence regardless of consequences. The moment stretched, balanced on the edge between tense standoff and explosive violence. Then a commotion at the crowd's edge broke the tension. Riders arriving at gallop dust rising behind them, federal marshals finally reaching Phoenix ahead of schedule. 6 men wearing federal badges, carrying federal warrants, bringing authority that superseded anything Ashford could claim. The lead marshal dismounted and approached the confrontation, reading the scene instantly. He addressed Ashford directly, voice carrying absolute authority. Colonel Vernon Ashford, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, abuse of federal authority, and genocide of indigenous populations. Surrender your weapons and come peacefully, or be taken by force. Ashford's face went pale, then flushed deep red as rage and fear warred for dominance. He looked at the marshals, at Brennan, at the crowd of townspeople who were beginning to understand the truth, and finally at Marcus and Naira, standing calmly behind federal protection. His hand moved toward his pistol, but before he could draw, words erupted from him. Words born from desperate need to justify to make someone understand. You're nobody, a deserter and a squaw. You think documents matter against the machinery of progress. This territory needs resources to thrive, needs land to expand. A few Indians standing in the way of civilization, that's not murder, that's inevitability. The crowd murmured, some heads nodding in unconscious agreement with the familiar justification. Marcus felt Naira tense beside him, felt her anger at hearing her people's deaths dismissed as acceptable casualties of expansion. He stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and Ashford until he stood close enough to see the desperation in the colonel's eyes. His voice came quiet but carrying a projecting to the crowd without shouting. Then call it murder or inevitability, I don't care which, but you'll answer for it either way. Because history has a long memory, Colonel, and when people tell the story of this territory's founding, they'll remember the villages you burned and the children you killed for gold. Your name will become the thing parents use to frighten their children, the monster in the dark, who wore a uniform and called evil good. Ashford's face contorted with rage at having his justifications thrown back at him. His hand moved toward his pistol in gesture that was pure desperation, knowing he was finished, but unable to surrender without attempting some final violence. Cade moved faster, drawing and firing in smooth motion born from years of professional killing. His shot was aimed at Naira's final attempt to complete his contract by eliminating the witness who could testify most compellingly. But Marcus had anticipated the move, stepping in front of Naira and taking the bullet in his left side. He felt pain exploding through his torso, dimly aware of gunfire erupting around him as federal marshals engaged Cade and Ashford's men. The firefight was brief but intense, federal authority overwhelming territorial corruption through superior positioning and legal legitimacy. Cade died quickly, shot multiple times by marshals who recognized attempted murder of federal witness. Ashford surrendered when his hired guns fled or fell, his face ashen with understanding of his complete defeat. Through the pain, Marcus felt Naira's hands on him, heard her voice calling his name with desperation that matched his own need to reassure her. He tried to speak, to tell her he would be fine, that taking the bullet was worth it to protect her, but words would not form properly. Darkness closed around him, pulling him down into unconsciousness, where pain existed, but could not quite reach his awareness. He woke in a hospital bed 3 days later, sunlight streaming through a window to his left, his torso wrapped in bandages that pulled tight when he breathed. Naira sat beside his bed, holding his hand, her eyes red from crying, but her expression brightening the moment she saw him wake. "You stupid man, you stepped in front of a bullet for me." Her voice held equal parts anger and relief and affection. Marcus managed a weak smile. Seemed like the right thing to do at the time. Did it work? Did we win? Naira's smile transformed her face, erasing years of grief and fear. We won. Ashford is in federal custody awaiting trial in Washington. All the officials who helped him are being investigated. The documents are in federal hands, and the story is spreading across every newspaper in the territory. We won, Marcus. Justice is actually happening. The words washed over him like absolution, 5 years of guilt and regret beginning to dissolve under the knowledge that something good had emerged from their struggle. Split Rock's dead would not be avenged directly. Nothing could bring them back, but their deaths would no longer be meaningless, no longer dismissed as unfortunate necessities of expansion. Truth had weight now, carried by documents that could not be suppressed or ignored. Marcus spent 2 weeks recovering in the Phoenix hospital, Naira remaining at his bedside throughout. Federal officials visited regularly, taking statements and gathering additional information to support their case against Ashford. The territorial newspapers ran stories about the scandal, turning public opinion rapidly against the colonel and everyone associated with him. The governor resigned under pressure, several judges faced recall elections, and the entire territorial administration underwent investigation. When Marcus was finally released from the hospital, he and Naira faced a question they had avoided during the immediate crisis: what came next? The documents were delivered, justice was in motion, their running was over. But they were still damaged, people still carrying wounds that transcended physical injuries. They needed time and space to heal, to figure out who they were beyond fugitives and witnesses. Thomas Brennan offered them a solution, a homestead grant in territory that had been returned to Apache control following federal investigation. The land was not split rock. Nothing could replace what Naira lost, but it was good land with water and grazing sufficient to support a new beginning. The grant came with federal protection and recognition of Naira's rights as Apache despite the government's historical refusal to acknowledge such rights. It was imperfect, insufficient to balance the scales after genocide, but it was more than nothing. Marcus and Naira accepted the offer, understanding it represented possibility, if not justice. They traveled together to the land, a valley 60 miles north of Phoenix, where a spring fed a permanent stream. The valley held echoes of what Marcus's Blackthorn Canyon might have been if he had ever tried to build something there instead of merely hiding. They spent the first months constructing a cabin together, working side by side in rhythm that came naturally to people who had fought together. The cabin was simple but solid, designed for two people who understood that home was built through choice and effort rather than inherited. They planted crops and acquired livestock, building slowly towards self-sufficiency that required no dependence on systems that had failed them both. Other Apache families arrived, gradually drawn by word that land was available without the restrictions and abuse that characterized reservation life. A small community formed, people who had lost everything beginning again with determination born from survival. Naira found purpose in helping others, teaching traditional skills and providing leadership to community that valued her experience and resilience. Marcus found his own purpose, teaching practical skills, carpentry, leatherwork, shooting, tracking. He became the community's link to white settlements, navigating trade relationships and legal complexities with the understanding of someone who had lived in both worlds. His desertion remained on federal record, but authorities chose not to pursue it, given his role in exposing Ashford's conspiracy. He would never wear cavalry blue again, but he no longer wanted to. A year passed, marked by seasons and small victories. The community grew to 30 people, sufficient to provide mutual support and defense without becoming large enough to attract unwanted attention. Crops succeeded despite drought. Livestock thrived despite predators. Life continued with the stubborn persistence of things that refused to die despite everything working against them. On the anniversary of the day Marcus lifted the boulder off Naira, they stood together on a hilltop overlooking the valley. 12 months had transformed raw land into something approaching home. The cabin looked solid and permanent in the distance, smoke rising from its chimney, children playing in the space between buildings where 3 new families had built their own structures. The corn grew tall in irrigated fields, and the livestock grazed peacefully in fenced pastures. Sarah Brennan lived with them, now having sold her property in Ironwood to escape the memories that haunted every corner of her old home. Her children attended the school Naira organized, learning both English and Apache traditional ways and frontier skills. They called Marcus Uncle, which made him uncomfortable in ways he could not quite articulate, but also pleased in ways he could not deny. Sheriff Garrett visited monthly, his suspension lifted after the full scope of territorial corruption became clear. He brought news from Phoenix and Santa Fe. Ashford's trial had concluded with a guilty verdict on all charges. The colonel would hang in 3 weeks along with 2 governors, 4 judges, and a dozen military officers implicated in the conspiracy. The newspapers called it the greatest corruption scandal in territorial history, which Garrett found grimly amusing, given how many such scandals had simply never been investigated. The Apache community grew slowly but steadily. Families trickled in from reservations where conditions remained desperate, drawn by word that land and autonomy were possible for those willing to work for them. Not everyone stayed. Frontier life was hard, and the trauma some carried proved too deep for healing, even in safety. But enough remained to build something that felt like continuity, like culture surviving, despite systematic attempts to erase it. Naira found purpose in teaching traditional skills to both Apache and white children, bridging worlds in ways her mother's generation could not have imagined. She taught medicine, tracking the proper ways to harvest plants and honor the land that sustained them. Marcus watched her thrive, saw the lines of constant tension fade from her face as months of peace accumulated into something approaching happiness. Marcus himself became something he never expected, a teacher of soldiers' skills turned to peaceful purpose. He taught construction, animal husbandry, marksmanship for hunting rather than warfare. Men who might have been his enemies in another time learned from him, now recognizing that survival required cooperation more than conflict. But the past never fully released its grip. Marcus still woke occasionally from nightmares where Little Crow Creek burned and he stood frozen, unable to move, unable to act. Naira still startled at unexpected sounds, her body remembering 3 months of flight and the hunter's footsteps always behind her. They carried their scars, some visible, like the bullet wound in Marcus's side, others hidden in the spaces between words they could not quite speak. On this anniversary evening, they stood close but not quite touching, watching the sun descend toward the western horizon. The valley spread below them in gradual shadow, their community's lights beginning to appear like earthbound stars marking the locations of people who had also lost everything and chosen to begin again. Do you regret it? Any of it? Naira's question referred to everything: the boulder, the running, the violence, the choice to stand rather than surrender. Marcus considered his answer carefully, wanting honesty rather than comfort. I regret every moment of pain you suffered because I involved myself in your fight. I regret the cabin I lost, the years of peace that ended when I lifted that boulder. I regret that justice required so much blood to achieve. He paused, then continued with absolute conviction. But I don't regret lifting that boulder. I don't regret standing with you against Cade and Ashford. Those choices made me the man I needed to be, the man I should have been at Little Crow Creek, but found too late. If I had those moments to live again, I would make the same choices, accept the same costs, because they were right choices regardless of consequences. Naira absorbed his words, testing them against her own complicated feelings about their shared history. When she answered, her voice carried hard-won wisdom. I regret that my family isn't here to see this, to know that their deaths mattered enough to bring justice. I regret the 3 months I spent running, always frightened, always alone. I regret that violence was necessary to achieve what words and laws should have accomplished peacefully. She reached for his hand, interlacing their fingers with practiced familiarity. But I don't regret finding you or fighting beside you or building this new life with you. You gave me back something I thought was destroyed at Split Rock, the belief that tomorrow might be better than today, and that fighting for better was worth the cost. They stood together as darkness fell completely, the stars emerging one by one in the vast desert sky. The community below continued its evening rituals, meals prepared, children called, inside animals secured for the night. Domestic normalcy proceeding because people chose to make it proceed, chose to build rather than destroy, chose hope despite knowing intimately what despair tasted like. Marcus thought about choices and consequences, about the paths that led him to this moment and the futures those paths created. 5 years ago, he chose conscience over duty at Little Crow Creek and lost everything. A year ago, he chose compassion over safety when he lifted a boulder, and that choice brought him here to a hilltop overlooking a valley of refugees who became settlers of survivors, who became builders of trauma that transformed into strength. Perhaps redemption was not about erasing past failures, but about choosing better when given the chance. Perhaps justice was not about perfect outcomes, but about refusing to accept injustice as inevitable. Perhaps love was not about being whole people who found each other, but about being broken people who chose each other and built something whole from their shared wreckage. The night wind carried scents of wood smoke and growing things of dust and water, of sage and horse and humanity. Naira leaned against him, and Marcus wrapped his arm around her shoulders, both of them comfortable with silence that required no filling. Below them in the valley, their community existed because of choices made and prices paid. It was not paradise; nothing built by human hands ever was. It was not revenge or compensation or adequate balance against genocide and conspiracy. But it was something. It was survival transformed into purposed trauma, converted into strength, two damaged people creating something whole from broken pieces. It was Marcus Stone and Naira building something new, one stone at a time, just as they promised each other in the wreckage of a burned cabin in the aftermath of violence. And in the great accounting of lives measured not by length but by meaning, perhaps that was enough. Perhaps that was everything.